Alrighty, chat. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Very true for today, actually, because what we're going to be doing today is talking a lot about ADHD. So I'm hoping to go over some ADHD concepts. We also have a couple of cool announcements to make. The biggest of which is that our Dr. K's guide to ADHD and doing stuff is live as of today. So it has been released. People have been waiting for it for a while. So I wanted to just take a minute to talk a little bit about the guide. We'll probably be watching one video from the guide. We'll be streaming one video, whatever kind of y'all choose, at the end. So my hope is to go through some TikToks today, maybe go through a couple of posts around ADHD. And what we're going to do is like see what people struggle with ADHD, right? So we're going to see like what the internet thinks about ADHD, what the internet talks about ADHD. And actually what we'll discover is that a lot of the topics that are discussed around ADHD in some way are covered in the guide. So then what we're going to do is we're going to let y'all pick based on everything that we like. We're going to browse the internet for a while and we're going to see like what kind of questions come up for ADHD. And once we know what kind of questions come up, y'all can pick one and we can watch the relevant video and we'll see, so like if you're using the guide to understand things about ADHD and attention and doing stuff, how useful could it possibly be? Okay, so we'll watch one together. Maybe we'll react to it a little bit. We'll see. So the first thing is that a lot of people have been wondering, like, why this thing? Okay, so our guide is called Dr. K's Guide to ADHD and Doing Stuff. And what I'd love to do is just start by sharing with y'all how we came up with this idea. So what I noticed was that, first of all, the amount of ADHD seems to be increasing. So we know that ADHD is being diagnosed more than it was, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. But then the kind of question became, okay, so if the rate of diagnosis is increasing, does that mean that more people are getting ADHD or that we're picking up or catching a lot of people who we missed the diagnosis for? And the answer is probably both. The other thing that I sort of noticed was that as we're using more and more technology, that our attention span is getting shorter. And what I heard from people in our community time and time and time again is that they're basically unable to do stuff, right? So they talk about laziness, they talk about discipline, they talk about motivation, they talk about I can't focus, I can't study, I can't, just all of the frustration with just go to the gym or just just study, just socialize more, just be confident in yourself. So what I noticed is that as we were trying to figure out, okay, what do we want to include in this guide? What I realized is we have forgotten as a society how to do stuff. And furthermore, the impact of technology is making it harder and harder for us to control our own minds. So as for example, major platforms get better and better at advertising and cookie tracking and stuff like that, as we develop more sophisticated video games, as we develop more engaging platforms, what's happening is we're losing control of our attention. As a society, we are slowly losing control of being able to tell our mind to do something and have our mind to do that thing. And what we're getting is more and more cases of doom scrolling. I wake up today, I start using a computer or phone or whatever, and then before I know it, 4 hours have gone by. Now I feel kind of unmotivated. I don't really feel like doing anything. It's hard for me to get started now. So there's something going on between our attention, our motivation, and our ability to do stuff. And so as we were digging into this, as I was trying to unpack, okay, how do we help people do things? We were talking about motivation. We also started to dig into ADHD and attention. And so we were struggling to come up with a name. It's okay, is it Guide to Motivation and ADHD? Well, is it about motivation? Well, it's more than motivation, right? So it's also about organization and prioritization and all of these other things. And so finally, we were struggling to come up with a name for the guide. And we decided to include ADHD because the core issue is attention. So how is technology changing our attention? How do we get control of our attention? How do we learn how to focus? So we were like, okay, guide to like focus and ADHD or focus and motivation, but what about ADHD? What about attention? So finally we decided like, okay, what is this guide about? So someone asked me, what is the guide about? I was like, it's about doing stuff. It's about how to do stuff and why it's hard to do stuff. And so that's why we called it Dr. K's Guide to ADHD and Doing Stuff. Now, why we chose to include ADHD, which is a disorder, a psychiatric diagnosis, because I think this is the disorder that is the most related to attention, motivation, and being able to do things. If we look at like, and we've covered the others, right? So it's hard to do stuff because maybe I have a mood disorder. Sometimes it's hard to do stuff because I have an anxiety disorder. But we've talked about depression. We've talked about anxiety. And so the next thing that sort of gets in the way of doing stuff, and if we really look at sort of doing stuff, that relates to attention. What's the clinical branch of attention? And that's where we get to ADHD. So that's why we made the guide. A couple of things about the guide. So it's longer. So if you look at, I think the other guides are 26 to 28 videos. The ADHD guide is 49 videos. So it's larger because it's about doing stuff. So we dig into a lot of the basics. So we're going to kind of show you all a little bit about the guide real quick. And then we'll get to reacting to things. Okay. So we also decided actually that the sphere grid wasn't going to work. So as we add more and more things to Dr. K's guide, we kind of realized that like we're not going to be able to like spherically, it's just too complicated. So now it's almost like, I don't know if you guys have played like Warhammer, but kind of leveling up. So this is Dr. K's guide. So there's anxiety, depression, and meditation, which we've already covered. And y'all may notice that, there's a lot of dots, but the ADHD guide in doing stuff has more dots. Okay. So it starts with intro. Like, what are we doing here? Next thing, we're going to talk a little bit about motivation. And then, as usual, we branch off into clinical track and non-clinical track. The clinical track is when I'm teaching medical students or residents, or I'm teaching patients, right? So not everything that you do as a clinician is therapy or medication. Sometimes it's something called psychoeducation, which is like teaching people, hey, by the way, here's the way that a mood disorder works. It's episodic. It's got these features. Here's the, things like that. So we're going to like do some basic explanation and education around ADHD. So as we kind of go into the ADHD, we'll talk about things like clinical criteria. So this is also the most neuroscience heavy guide that we've done. So this is where when I work with people who struggle with attentional problems, what we realize is that there's a lot of circuits in the brain that have to do with doing things. And if we really want to get control of our behavior, I hate to do this. Like I tried to simplify it over and over and over again, but the final conclusion that I came to is that actually we just need to learn neuroscience, that like neuroscience needs to be a basic part of what we learn about ourselves. And we can try to simplify things and reduce things and create metaphors and analogies as much as you want to. But ultimately, I think that understanding your own brain is one of the most useful competencies you can have today. So it's quite neuroscience heavy, which sometimes you guys may have to watch that more than once. So we kind of go over overview of neuroscience. Then we talk about executive function. And then we actually go into a bunch of interesting info about comorbidities. So what's the relationship between ADHD and depression? What's the relationship between ADHD and addictions, ADHD and anxiety? I know it's kind of weird because social function is not a diagnosis, right? But there's actually a lot of really interesting impacts in the brain, how if you have a non-neurotypical brain, how that affects social function. And I think difficulties in social situations is one of the most underappreciated impacts of having an attention deficit disorder. We also talk a lot about kids. So we see that a lot of parents will struggle with kids with ADHD. So we kind of talk a little bit about overviews of treatment for both children and adults. And then we talk a lot about the challenges of parenting in ADHD, and then also like how to approach a child with ADHD. Once again, none of this is designed to be a substitute for medical care. But what we sort of tend to find is that even if you look at like, medical care, there's a bunch of patient information. So there's like packets and worksheets and things like that. And what we've tried to do is really try to provide like very, very high quality information about ADHD to parents, to people, etc. Okay? So that's the clinical stuff. I think what's more fun is the non-clinical stuff. So you'll notice that, this is maybe like, I don't know, maybe like a dozen videos or so. But the bulk of the guide is really like in understanding how the mind decides to do things. So we go into all kinds of things like goal setting and motivation. So we're not really taught how to set goals. So part of the reason that people like screw up with their goals and they're like, oh, I'm not accomplishing anything in life is because we're not actually taught how to set goals. And if you learn how to set goals properly, it actually makes it way easier to gain motivation. A couple of other things. So we talk about things like mindset. Okay, so this is based on Carol Dweck's work. So we felt like the guide was incomplete without at least touching on it. The other thing that I notice is that there are a lot of people who will talk about mindset, but very few people will tell you the specific steps to shifting your mindset. So like what I think is missing is people will say, oh, like a learning or growth mindset is better than a performance mindset. But how do you make the shift? Like what is the fundamental steps of making a shift? And what I've discovered in my clinical work was essentially like almost like a formula for shifting mindsets. So we'll also talk about things like pitfalls and other kinds of tips, things like how to deal with getting overwhelmed. And what you'll notice is that things like this are, goal setting and getting overwhelmed are just experiences that human beings have. These are not necessarily like clinical in nature. And yet, whether you have a clinical illness, whether you have ADHD or depression or anxiety or none of the above, all of us sometimes get overwhelmed. And so how do you deal with something as simple as getting overwhelmed? What can we understand about it, why it happens, where it comes from, and maybe a couple of steps at like how to get started and not getting overwhelmed. So then we also get to, some of our more spiritual stuff. So for those of y'all that appreciate the Vedic model of the mind and samskars, so we've gotten really, really good feedback about these specific samskars that I tend to see a lot in people who struggle with depression or sadness or feeling like they're behind in life. So like these we get really good feedback on. So what we actually did is focused on 5 motivational samskars. So what this means is that sometimes our mind tells us particular things. When I ask someone, hey, why aren't you motivated? Someone comes to me and says, oh, I struggle with motivation. And if we ask someone, okay, like, what does your mind actually do? Like, what is the experience of struggling with motivation? And what we discover is that when someone says, I'm not motivated, their mind is actually telling them particular things. Like it's telling them things like, I'm different. And specifically what this sort of says is, it'll say things like, oh, this may work for other people, but it doesn't work for me. Or they'll say things like, your mind will tell you, we're not ready yet. Let's get more ready. Let's prepare more before we actually do it. Or it'll say things like, it's a waste of time. If we do this, it'll be a waste of time. There's no point in doing it because it'll end up being a waste of our time. And we can't afford to waste any time. So, or it doesn't matter what I do. Like the world these are like the doomers, right? It doesn't matter what I do because the world is in such a bad place, particular things outside of me that are out of my control. It doesn't matter what I do. And the tricky thing is that once your mind tells you it doesn't matter what I do, once you arrive at that conclusion, naturally it's really hard to motivate yourself, right? The tricky thing is that we assume that when our mind tells us this, that our mind is correct, that it doesn't matter what I do. But as we'll learn, our mind learns to tell us it doesn't matter what I do for any number of reasons. And if your mind is telling you that, how to start unraveling that so you can start to be motivated again. So those are kind of samskars. Then we go into a lot of really key tips on organization. So if you're struggling to get stuff done, how can we structure our environment? How can we understand different influences on motivation? How can we understand certain principles of neuroscience that'll improve our motivation? And then even like, how can we start to develop healthy technology habits? So then what we're going to do is actually go into the science of thought. Okay, so like, what do we know about thoughts? Like, what do we know about like the neuroscience of thought? So we'll talk about the neuroscience of motivation, dopamine reward circuitry, hedonic reward circuitry. This is neuroscience heavy once again. Talk a little bit about dopamine reset and detox. And this is one of the most important discoveries that I made while researching this stuff, is this thing called the action success calculation, which is really, really interesting because what this sort of reveals is that our confidence ultimately determines our motivation. Because what happens when we're motivated to do something, our brain does not get motivated to do things unless they have a high likelihood of success, right? So like your brain, you don't wake up today and walk out the door and decide, oh, I'm going to make a competitor to Starlink or Tesla. I'm going to just start a company that's going to compete with them and I'm going to do better than them. Because the chances of likelihood of success is very, very low. And so the tricky thing is that if we struggle with motivation, everyone is talking about like productivity and like do the Pomodoro technique and all this kind of stuff. But if you struggle with motivation, the question is, how confident are you in yourself? And the interesting thing is that if we have low self-esteem, our brain calculates the likelihood of failure is high. If the likelihood of failure is high, then there's no point in getting motivated, right? Why bother if we're going to fail? And so the interesting thing that a lot of people miss is that if you want to increase your motivation, you have to work on your confidence and your self-esteem. So we're also going to talk about resistance. So like when I want to do something, this is a little bit discrete. Sometimes something gets in the way. So learning more about our emotions, learning about our ego or ahamkar. So this is going to be a little bit more of the spiritual side of things, and even explicitly talking about procrastination. And then also on kind of the spirituality side of things. So there's origin of action, and then we kind of go down here, origin of motivation. And then we get to some more advanced kind of almost like spiritual or yogic concepts about controlling our thoughts. So I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but there's a formal way to concentrate. Concentration is a skill, but we're not taught the skill of concentration. So what we're going to do is teach, like what I learned in the ashram was like yogis taught me. They're like, hey, here's how you concentrate. And I was like, this is amazing. So we're also going to learn a lot about the origin of thoughts, how to control our thoughts, and then a little bit about this concept of cognitive drains. So that's the guide. It's 49 videos. I don't know if you guys can see, but in some places there are these icons. So there are meditations included in the guide. So there's meditations for procrastination, ego, emotions. This stuff is going to have a lot of meditations. So we're going to teach another branch of meditation from Raja Yoga called Pratyahara. So this, for example, has 3 videos associated with it. I don't know if you guys can kind of see that. So that's the guide. I really hope it helps y'all. Some of the stuff, so feedback that we've gotten about prior guides, some people are sort of saying like, oh, like I've heard a lot of this before. That's common. So this is something where we try to talk about what's important. And the challenge with, if you guys are regular consumers, or if y'all are regular consumers of our YouTube channel or Twitch channel, some of this stuff may be familiar, which is okay. I mean, it's not necessarily intentional. It's just that if something is important to talk about, we don't necessarily just want to save it for the guide, right? If it's important to talk about and it's helpful to people, we want to stream about it. We want to make videos about it so it helps everybody. The goal of the guide is really that there's advanced concepts that you can't really get to in a streaming capacity, because what happens in streaming is that people come and people go. So what the challenge that we face is, if I were to do, like, let's say ADHD of impulse control and addictions, this lecture requires understanding the neuroscience of ADHD. It requires understanding this, and this is pretty dense stuff. So by the time that we get to more advanced concepts, like what is the interface between ADHD and addictions, we need it to be built on these things. And so in a streaming format or even a YouTube video format, like, people don't watch things in order, right? They watch just kind of what appeals to them in the moment. So the reason we built the guide is really to offer more advanced stuff. Some of the stuff y'all may have heard before, which is totally fine. The other thing about the guide is it's going to be a lot more practical. So it's sort of designed to be used longitudinally. There are worksheets and exercises and accompanying meditations and things like that, which on a given stream, for example, we may talk about 5 or 6 different things. We do one meditation that's kind of at the end. You can't really teach advanced meditation on stream. So if you guys are really interested in more applicable stuff, more practical stuff, and deeper stuff, then the guide is for you. And the other reason that we built the guide is that for those of you who haven't watched stream for, let's say, 3 years, and you don't have the time to go back and watch 400 hours of streams, totally understand. That's why we built the guide. So if you haven't watched any of our content, you can just start with the module. And the whole point is that it's it's comprehensive, right? So it's going to teach you everything that you need to know. Make sense? Questions? Okay. Where do we find the guide? So I think it's at, I don't know actually. Yeah. So you just click the bit.ly link. So no, so the way that it works, Gayas name is, I don't know how to pronounce your thing, is that, so you can get the guides individually or a bundle, whichever one you prefer. So for people who are interested in learning it all, you can get them all. I'm sure I imagine there's a discount price. I actually don't, I kind of stay away from some of that stuff, but, you know, you can just pick. So like if you're interested in ADHD and doing stuff and want to understand motivation and things, just get that one. If you're interested in meditation, just get that one. I don't have ADHD but have focus issues. Would this be good for me? I hope so. So this is where we didn't make the guide. I don't know if you saw this. So I'm Wheelan is saying I don't have ADHD but I have focus issues. Like, so I'll illustrate to you. So that's what it's for. So as I mentioned, there's only maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's 12 videos in the clinical track, and there's like 30 videos in the non-clinical track. So if you want to understand, I have trouble with focus, like how to concentrate, you know, how to control the thoughts in your mind, how to further control the thoughts in your mind, the different things that are cognitive drains that make it hard for you to focus. So like if you have trouble focusing, do you get overwhelmed? How can you modify your environment to facilitate your thinking? What are your technology habits? What's going on in your brain, right? So there are all kinds of different things that go into difficulty focusing. And that's kind of like why we built the guide the way that we did. It's not all about ADHD. It's the focus is, you know, less than half of the guide is clinical. The majority of it is like how to do stuff. The thing is, I don't think that how to do stuff, that discussion is not complete without at least an exploration of the fact that some people are not neurotypical and their brains are actually different. So you can create generalized advice for people about the science of thought and things like that, but there are going to be some necessary exceptions to that we have to take into account in the case of ADHD. Would it be valuable for a teacher to watch these? Ekiz is asking. In the past, the answer to that question has been yes. So there are teachers in our community that have not only watched our stuff and found it really useful, have actually like packaged it into presentations and taught it at their schools and gotten really positive feedback. If I buy it, I'm going to accomplish all my goals. I doubt it. So hopefully the guide will help you do is, first of all, pick the appropriate goals, let go of some goals, shocking, and then equip you for the greatest chance to succeed at those goals, right? So people will be like, oh, I have these goals. Like, where did those goals come from? Did they come from expectations that your parents had? So is that actually a good goal? Are you going to live your best life if you succeed at that goal? Because we have a lot of people in our community who do that. They accomplish all the goals that they set out to do. And they weren't their goals. They were given those goals. And then 30 years later, they're miserable. Why don't you just scream, why can't you focus? It's apparently the most up-to-date ability to fix ADHD from the education system. I'm with you, Aiden J. That's why. So we're trying, so here's how we work at HD. We see a problem. And there are two approaches in life, right? You can say like, oh, the educational system needs to fix it. And that's true. The educational system does need to fix it. But this is like, people can't wait for the educational system to fix it. Y'all get that? Like, people are struggling to focus, and they're being told time and time and time again, just focus more. Person doesn't live up to their potential. And like, how many years is it going to take? Should we fix the educational system? Absolutely. How many years is that going to take? What about the people? Like, sure, so 10 years, let's say we devote a lot of effort, we transform education. What about the 8-year-olds who are alive today? 10 years from now, they're going to be 18. What's going to happen to them? So we try to build resources. We try to build resources to help y'all today. We do our best to make it accessible. You can't dumb it down too much, unfortunately. We tried our best, but sometimes this stuff is complicated. Sometimes there's a lot to it. And this is where it's kind of a choose your own adventure. You don't have to watch everything, right? So that's the other thing about this guide is you look at this and you're like, holy crap, this is a lot. When am I ever going to get into all this? You don't have to watch all of it. That's the whole point. So the guide mirrors what I started doing in my office, which is that I don't talk about all of these things with every single person that comes into my office. I just pick the ones that are relevant. And so some people may struggle with goal setting and motivation. Some people may struggle with like the spiritual aspect of it. Some people may struggle with it, like may actually have a clinical diagnosis. So then we like have to talk about executive function. So that's the whole point is you don't have to watch it all. Just watch the stuff that is helpful to you. And over time, probably good if you watch everything. But, you know, like that's why it's designed this way. Okay? So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. Okay. So Azriel, for people who have previously have the guide or in coaching, is a new module free. So I think as is normal, if you're enrolled in coaching, you get access to the guides for the duration that you're in coaching. I think if you've purchased previous guides, I don't think that this guide is included in that because that's the previous purchase. I could be wrong there. And then people who have been coaching in the past, sort of like the guide is meant as a supplement to coaching. So if you've been in coaching in the past, I don't think you get access to this guide. If you sign up for coaching again, it's kind of like, think about it like if I go to a university, I get access to the library, but while I'm a student, right? So we sort of include it in the cost of coaching, if that kind of makes sense. So a couple of other things to remember. So the first is that we really appreciate everyone supporting the stream and things like that based on, you know, the support that y'all give us. First session of coaching is actually on us. So HG will pay for your coaching for one session. So if y'all are interested in trying coaching, we've also recently, the coaches have access to the guide as well. So we've sort of, a lot of our coaches hopefully can help you with this kind of stuff. So if y'all are watching a part of the guide and are trying to figure out, okay, can coaching help with this? Hopefully the answer is yes. It kind of depends on what aspect it is. If you're looking for help on something on the clinical track, I don't recommend that you sign up for coaching. I recommend that you get a clinical evaluation and actually seek medical care, right? So if you're like watching the clinical stuff and you're like, oh, wait, actually, this really sounds like me, then I would recommend that you go see a therapist. Couple of things to remember about coaching that if y'all do sign up, remember that outcomes, we see optimal outcomes at about 12 weeks. So we'll see 25 to 45% reductions in depression to anxiety. We'll see 58% increases in average increase at 12 weeks, I think is 58% in sense of direction or life purpose. We also see boosts to EQ. Those tend to be on the smaller side, so 10%, 11% of things like emotional awareness, emotional regulation. But we also do see different kinds of boosts in other things like confidence in your career trajectory. In career coaching at 12 weeks or something is 25%, 33%, something like that. So we look at a lot of different outcomes in coaching that are really, the orientation of our outcomes is in helping you build a life. It's not in to try to treat something. Okay? Are absolute beginners to you in psychology able to understand the modules? That's how they're designed. So they're designed to be completely independent. You don't need to know who Dr. K is. In fact, I may introduce myself at the beginning. I have to prioritize? What? Asks Swamini. You don't have to prioritize. You can continue not prioritizing. But if you want things to be easier for you, I would recommend prioritization, which, by the way, is a skill, which we aren't formally taught. That helps us do stuff. Thanks for the Prime Gaming sub, Loff. Appreciate it. So Total Teeter is asking, Too Tall Teeter is asking, ADHD symptoms sound ubiquitous. At what point is it a disorder? Is it a spectrum present in everyone? Great question. So I think we're going to get to this in a second. So let's hop in. Actually, let's hop into that because I think we've got some stuff directly related to that. So we're going to start by taking a look at TikTok, and then we'll kind of move on from there. Oh, no. Okay. So let's do this. Up. Let's look at TikToks. My favorite things to do. Okay. Alrighty. So let's take a look at some TikToks. I wonder if this, let me know.
As of late, yeah. I've been confused as of late, yeah.
Okay. So we're going to pause here for a second. So I think the first thing is, like, when I watch TikToks like this, what I notice is that there's a visceral sense of being, like, fundamentally out of control with your motivation. Right? It's like, this is some dark imagery. Right? Like, look at this. Right? Like, this is disturbing. Technology addiction. Struggling to get yourself started. Right? Like, this image is wild. You know? And so I think this is the challenge, is that in society, we don't teach people. We don't teach people how to motivate themselves, right? There's just this assumption that just motivate yourself, right? And no one breaks down to us why it's hard to motivate yourself. No one breaks down how we're supposed to motivate ourselves. No one even breaks down what's an appropriate amount of motivation. Because what happens if you're struggling with motivation is you assume that the rest of the world is really motivated because they're out and doing things while you're sitting at home. But what's even normal? Like, what's the normal amount of motivation that human beings have? Are you actually different? Are you busted in some way? And in the absence of all that information, that's the conclusion everyone comes to. I'm busted, right? And then you dig real deep, you try to struggle to get yourself out of the pit, and you succeed for a little while, but then you kind of slip back in. What are all the factors that go into successfully and sustainably motivating yourself? And this is what's missing. So I think these TikToks do a good job of kind of illustrating that. Let's move on.
Focus, come on. I'm trying. Come on. Focus, 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 focus. Let's go. I can't do this. I can't do it.
So I think that's great. Like, this is a fantastic explanation, or not explanation, but a fantastic example of what happens when people struggle to focus. So when you struggle to focus, you need to focus, right? You got to read a textbook. And then what you essentially do is you try to bludgeon yourself into focusing. Because that's like, I have to focus. I need to focus. I have to do something. I need to do something. And then you force yourself. But then what actually happens is there's a part of your mind that wants to wander. And there's a part of your mind that is trying to get that other part to rein in. And so what are you doing? Anytime you're focusing, what you're actually doing is fighting a war within your mind. As you fight a war within your mind gets exhausted. And so even though you need to study, you're spending all of your mental energy not actually on learning, but on forcing your brain to try to learn. And so this is a really common problem. So there are a couple of things to remember about this kind of stuff. And the first is that depending on a lot of other factors, which we cover in Dr. K's guide, so this is why we kind of cover a lot of this stuff. So I'm just going to show a couple of things that I think are relevant here. The first is that if you want to focus, there's a lot of stuff around environment and even some interesting research on top-down and bottom-up thinking. So for example, if you have sensory input in your general vicinity, even if it's not something that you're focusing on, if there's if your room is messy, for example, all of that mess actually leads to a cognitive load and will make it harder for you to focus. There are a lot of other things that you can do around goal setting and prioritization and getting overwhelmed. These are all different aspects that you can kind of look into for improving your focus. Because at the end of the day, focus is absolutely a skill that you can use. Another thing that I think this has been one of my top experiences with working with patients with ADHD is forcing their mind to focus is not nearly as effective as awakening some of their strengths and leveraging those towards their goals. So I'll give you a simple example. So most of the people that I've worked with ADHD are very curious. They get excited about things. The interesting thing is that when they try to study, they're approaching it from I need to do X or I want to do X. There's no awakening of curiosity and interest. And even for a topic like organic chemistry, if you approach it in the right way, it can actually be really, really cool. Even OChem, which I hated for the first half of college. But sort of this is where we're not really taught. If you're not, we sort of assume that interest is something that we don't control, right? Oh, I'm interested in this or I'm not interested in this. But let's think about that for a second. What determines interest? It turns out that interest in and of itself can be cultivated in a particular thing. We have language like acquired taste, right? So certain things are acquired tastes. How do you develop an acquired taste? There are actually ways that you can alter your interests. And so understanding all of these different steps, what is the nature of motivation? What is the nature of interest? What is the nature of focus and concentration? How do you level these things up? How can I craft my environment? If you're someone who is just brute forcing your way through college or university or high school or whatever, because you struggle to focus, that's really, really kind of not a great strategy, because every moment that you struggle with yourself, you're just exhausting your mind. And then that's the same mind that you're supposed to use to learn. So instead, understand all these other dimensions and you'll be way, way better at actually studying. Let's move on. I really liked that one. Okay, that's just, I guess that's the same thing, just a lot louder.
Wait, here's a test
Okay.
to see if you have ADHD. Let's find out.
Start by focusing on the green flashing dot in the center. The longer you stay focused, the surrounding dots will start to vanish. But as soon as you let your eyes wander a little, the dots will start to reset itself. If you can only make one or two of the dots vanish, then you find it hard to focus and are easily distracted. But if you can make them all vanish, then you have a normal attention span. Only 1% of people on the planet can make all the dots vanish for more than 5 seconds. Let me know how you did, and like, follow, and share.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. I'm really curious about sources for this kind of stuff. So this is what I both love and hate about TikTok. So this is a really interesting exercise. And by the way, I don't know if y'all remember, but we actually routinely teach on stream how to focus on one point, right? That's actually a meditation technique that we teach on stream called Trataka. So that's also, I mean, it's not in the ADHD guide, but it's in, I think, the guide to meditation. So I'd be really curious about a source around this. So I also know that, for example, like, you know, moving your eyes. So eye movement can be a little bit independent of a variable, where like some people just move their eyes more than other people do. Like some people are shifty eyed. And I don't know if that really correlates. I'd be really curious about sources for this kind of stuff. And that's what actually worries me the most about TikTok, is that I don't know about the quality of information that's getting disseminated. I think it's kind of a cool test. But as you said, 99% of people can't focus their attention for more than make the dots disappear for 5 seconds. Like, that's interesting.
This is what I'm
Okay.
diagnosed ADHD in a kid could sound like. I was actually diagnosed with ADHD till I was 29, which is known as an adult diagnosis, and I spent all of my formal education with ADHD. That was fun. Absolutely not. So then when I got diagnosed, you have to take in evidence, things like your school reports. The psychiatrist actually stopped me and said, this is very unusual. Usually we just have a couple of hints, but with you, it's on every page. I've got my school reports and we're going to go through a couple of them. First off, we have year 8. I would have been 13 years old, and focus and time management is mentioned on every single page. So Danielle needs to make a more determined effort to bring her achievement in line with her abilities. She is a lively and likeable member of the class, however, needs to be more disciplined in completing homework and handing it in on time. Science. Danielle is an enthusiastic member of the class. She contributes well to class discussion, but can easily get quite carried away. She's produced some good work this year, but often needs to spend more time checking content. She will need to improve on concentration. She can be easily distracted and still has a tendency to rush into work without listening to all the instructions. Written work is sometimes rather careless, so she needs to pay attention to the detail of the content. She does just enough to get by, but she needs to continue to try her hardest to concentrate in class, correct her work thoroughly, and apply herself more diligently. Her behaviour and attitude have been a bit better recently, although there still needs to be some improvement. She settled down a great deal, but can still find it hard to concentrate, and particularly to check her work. Danielle chatted through her lessons and is easily distracted. She rushed objects to get them done quickly. The big one. She is a likeable, sociable girl, and I enjoy chatting with her. She is, however, very loud and can be disruptive to other pupils. Her distractibility often means she does not make enough effort with her work, but she does have the ability to do better. The main area for her to work on is to listen more. This is all from one year report. This is year 11, and again it's got very similar. Enthusiastic, lively, however, with so many ideas running through her head, organisation is still an issue, and a lack of focus is an ongoing battle for her. Literally written in my year 11 report. Not a word, not a peep of ADHD mentioned. Closing note on this one though is she is a young woman who has a passion to see things happen and obviously wants to make a difference. We have no doubt she will. I just find it fascinating how with all of those hints, all of those clues, no one picked up on it, no one suggested it. And that was less than 20 years ago. It's a great thing that we're changing the conversation now, but this is why I do recommend go and get checked. Sometimes the most obvious things are just being missed. This is what I'm...
Yeah, so I really liked this. I thought it was funny because some people are saying like, I wasn't really able to pay attention for the whole thing, which I think is kind of interesting. But I think it's a really good example of ADHD being the most overdiagnosed and the most underdiagnosed illness that I've seen, at least psychiatrically. So I've kind of noticed this time and time again where we miss so much diagnosis of ADHD. And why is that? I think it's because you've got, first of all, a lack of like education about what it looks like. Second thing is that you have so many kids who are good at compensating. So what I tend to see is that the most severe ADHD that I've seen, the worst 5% of ADHD is always undiagnosed. And you may say like, Dr. K, that's kind of weird. Why would the worst 5% of ADHD be undiagnosed? How could you miss if it's so bad? Because the worst ADHD that I consistently see is diagnosed in people who have very high IQs and develop tons of compensatory mechanisms. They'll also have high conscientiousness, high neuroticism, which means they'll be very, very hardworking, and they'll be incredibly, incredibly prone to things like anxiety and worry, which they'll actually use to fuel or overcompensate for their ADHD. So if I'm distracted, for example, if I learn how to worry and be paranoid, then even if I forget, I've got this safety valve of paranoia. Did I forget? Did I forget? Did I forget? And so it's really bizarre, but sometimes what you'll see is very severe ADHD in people who just brute force their way through life with IQ or effort. And we actually completely miss the diagnosis. I also think it's really sad, but what this person is kind of saying is really common too, where like teachers will say like, oh, this kid isn't living up to their potential. They're lovely, a lot of fun to talk to, can be distracted, needs to focus more, needs to listen better, needs not living up to their potential. And the other really devastating thing is that if you listen to that feedback, almost all of the feedback suggests that greater effort on the person's part would lead to success, right? I don't know if y'all were really paying attention to that, but they'll say like, if she applied herself more, she just needs to try harder. And so then what happens is kids with ADHD are growing up, the ADHD is missed, and it's always attributed to a lack of effort. What do you think that does to a child's self-esteem, right? When you're struggling and you really can't do it, but everyone around says the reason you can't do it is because you're not trying hard enough. Then you start to really develop this idea that like, oh, stupid me, like I could be successful at everything if only I did this. And then you start to internalize that, and then you'll start to internalize the self-judgment as well, because you're just such an idiot that you could do it, but you choose not to do it even though you really want to. You want to make everyone happy. You want to do well in school. You want to make friends. But you're just too dumb to like put forth the effort, and so it becomes a vicious cycle. And what we tend to find, and we go into a lot of detail in the guide, but we've talked about this before as well. So if you look at the comorbidity of ADHD and depression, what you tend to find is that if you take people with depression diagnosed first, and you go 15 years later, 3% of people with depression will have ADHD. On the flip side, if you take people who have both illnesses, what you'll tend to find is that this is a subpopulation of the comorbidity. So if you take people with ADHD, 70 to 80% of them can grow up to have depression. So what we tend to find is that ADHD can induce depression later on. And what I really like about this TikTok actually is that it really captures every time someone falls short. If we don't discover the ADHD, it ends up being an effort gap. It ends up being a shortcoming of the person. And the person internalizes that and they wind up with depression or a mood disorder down the road. So it's really sad. There's a part of me that says we should educate teachers, right? Like they need to be referring, but there's another part of me that says like teachers already have enough on their plate. I don't really know exactly. I mean, should teachers catch this? Sure. But like, I don't know. I think that's going to be tough. Okay, let's start. I really wish that TikTok did not autoplay things. Okay, page. Okay. Yeah, so I think that this also captures an unfortunately really common experience that people have, which is that, when people with ADHD struggle, people don't know how to recognize it. And so the trickiest thing that I oftentimes see is kids with ADHD with neurotypical parents. And the neurotypical parent never struggled with this. So if the child struggles with it, they just assume that the child is kind of like neurotypical, right? So I don't know if that kind of makes sense. So let me try to say that again. This is really unfortunate because sometimes you'll have a neurotypical parent and a child with ADHD. And when the child with ADHD comes and complains to the parent, hey, I'm struggling to pay attention in class, what the parent automatically does is read into the child's experience with their own. So they think about their life. When I was my daughter's age in this case, and I struggled with my attention, what was the answer? The answer was actually a lack of effort, because generally speaking, I'm neurotypical. So when I don't focus, it actually is a lack of effort. And effort is sufficient at overcoming my lack of focus. And so when the child comes and talks to the parent and says, I'm struggling with my attention, the parent essentially says, because they're neurotypical, it worked for me, therefore it should work for you. So I oftentimes will find that parents will be kicking and screaming against getting their child considered for an evaluation of ADHD. They almost feel like if my kid gets diagnosed with ADHD, it's like a free pass. It's like an excuse for all this kind of stuff, that instead they just need to discipline themselves harder and they need to focus more. And it's really unfortunate when I see these cases, man. It can be so sad.
If you do these things,
Okay.
you might have ADHD. 1. Trouble focusing on tasks. 2. Extreme obsessive interest in some new hobby. 3. Trying to relive that obsessive interest in your hobby in the work you have to do. 4. Purchasing a ton of equipment or supplies for that new hobby you're obsessed with. 5. Starting a brand new shiny habit and then totally forgetting about it the very next day. 6.
I gotta pause this for a second. So this is one of the things that actually kind of bothers me, is that there are a lot of things within the range of normal human experience that are worse for people with ADHD. But some of these, like, you know, like dropping a habit is actually like normal for humans, right? People who are able to start a habit and just stick to it, that's the exception. That's not the rule. So I'm not saying that these things aren't harder for people with ADHD, but so far this person is describing everything that's, in my opinion, within the normal range of human experience.
Total inconsistency in all aspects of your life. 7.
Okay, that's just kind of total inconsistency in all aspects of your life. That sounds like a very extreme language. I almost wonder if this person has almost figured out how to make an emotional appeal. Like, no one has total inconsistency in all aspects of their life. That's actually completely impossible. I guarantee you that 99.999% of people wipe their ass with the same hand after taking a dump. You're not totally inconsistent in all aspects of your life. I guarantee you that people are right-handed or left-handed, the majority of them. Some of us are ambidextrous. You know? So, like, some of us, like, taste food before adding salt, and some of us add salt before tasting food. Right? You get what I'm saying? So sometimes I'll see things like this and it's an emotional appeal, right? So like when you say total inconsistency in all aspects of your life, there's going to be someone out there who's listening to TikTok, who's like, man, I can't be consistent in any aspect of my life. And they watch this TikTok and they're like, yeah, this resonates with me. It's an emotional connection. And so that kind of stuff spreads, right? But then what happens, what we've got to be careful about, because this is ADHD Pro, is that then people with ADHD will start to think this is a sign of ADHD. And this is where we have to be very careful. Because once we attribute all of these things to ADHD, if you get treatment for ADHD, all of these things should be fixed. But I can guarantee you that high quality treatment for ADHD will not make you able to have consistency in all aspects of your life. Will not make it effortless for you to adopt a new habit. Right? That's where we've got to be really careful. And I see this a lot where people will like, ADHD is becoming such a grab bag of stuff. But some of this stuff is like just being a normal human. Like it's hard to do stuff if you're a human.
Brain fog. Some days your brain just does not want to get to work. And no matter what you do, you just can't get it started. 8. A total inability.
Okay, hold on a second. So I think brain fog is actually a diagnostic feature of many things, but I would not actually say that brain fog is it's not one of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. It's just something that people struggle with a lot, and I think it has more to do with stuff like technology usage.
To do things you really want to do. 9. Twitching or fidgeting. Number 10. Getting into arguments or debates. Number 11. Getting frustrated at random things that you know you shouldn't get frustrated at.
Okay, so sometimes emotional dysregulation we can see. I'm going to just rewind a little bit.
Started. 8. A total inability to do things you really want to do. 9.
So that's why we have Dr. K's Guide to ADHD and doing stuff, right? So because doing stuff is not just about ADHD.
Twitching or fidgeting.
That's
Number 10, getting into arguments
criteria.
or debates. Number 11, getting frustrated at random things that you know you should.
There's actually a subtype of ADHD that's being considered. So it may be like an actual diagnosable subtype, but attention deficit disorder with emotional dysregulation, which is kind of interesting.
Shouldn't get frustrated at. 12, you're a jack of all trades. You can do a whole bunch of different things because you've been obsessed with them at some point. Now you're kind of good at a lot of different things. 13, you think.
So I'm going to pause there too. So I think this once again is like, we've talked about Vata. So we haven't been talking quite as much about Ayurveda. just because I think some people in our community made some very valid criticisms about how the science supporting a lot of the Ayurvedic stuff is early, let's say, and even that arguably is generous. But I do think that there are some personality types, and I think high amounts of Vata is a good example of this, where you're like a jack of all trades, master of none. And that I don't think is a consequence of ADHD. It's just there are different cognitive styles, right? So some people are like, we've got our fighters, we've got our wizards, we've got our rogues, and occasionally we'll have a bard that can do all three.
Think you're lazy or you have an effort problem. If you think I missed any, put them in the comments and I'll try to respond. I love when people share. If you do these...
Okay. It's interesting. I think it's kind of a grab bag, but I get the sense that the person's heart is in the right place. There's some good stuff in there too.
So you want to survive school, but you have ADHD / I think a couple countries still call it ADD / you just have executive functioning issues. You're in the right place. Step number 1, stop trying to motivate yourself with a brain that can't create its own internal motivation. Instead, focus on momentum. For example, the might as well principle. Might as well do one homework problem. Oh look, your homework's done. All or nothing, baby. Now how did I even remember I had homework? Alarms, reminders, and...
Okay, let's pause there for a second. First of all, this guy's loud. But I think... I think he touches on a good point here, which is that sometimes it's easy to get lost in a task. So starting is the hardest part. And thankfully, for some people with ADHD, that's the case, where like getting started is the hardest part. The thing, though, is that if you remember, ADHD distractibility is also a key feature of ADHD. So the whole problem with ADHD is that, unlike a neurotypical brain, once you get started with something, you don't necessarily see it through to the end. In fact, it's way easier for some people to get started on stuff a la the last TikTok and leave it halfway done, that we get distractible.
And I don't know, Post-it notes, maybe? Now look, your prioritization skills...
Okay, so next thing he talked about alarms, calendars, reminders. So that's really interesting. So if you look at cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD, one feature of actual treatment for ADHD is in teaching people organizational skills. So there's some really interesting research. So if you compare medication to psychotherapy, because a lot of times when people have ADHD, what I tend to find as a clinician is they have a very strong view of medication. Now, a strong view of medication doesn't mean they're in favor of medication or necessarily that they're against it. They're just really strong about it. Some of them come in and they're like, I need meds, I need Adderall, like, let's get started with Adderall. Can we have Adderall, please? On the flip side, there are other people who are like, no medication, no medication, no medication, no medication for my kid, no medication for me, like no medication, none. So people will be very, very opinionated about medication. So a lot of times they'll ask a question, which is, does medication for ADHD really work? And so the data on this is really interesting. So generally speaking, on the whole, psychotherapy is as effective as medication for ADHD. If you take 100 people with psychotherapy, 100 people with ADHD medication, what you tend to find is that the improvement in symptoms is about the same. Another interesting principle of ADHD is that if you combine the two, they outperform either one on its own, which is generally speaking true of most psychiatric illnesses. Here's the really interesting thing, though. If someone with ADHD medication stops ADHD medication, you tend to see a reversion to the prior state. So you'll see some improvement, which will even last beyond when you stop taking the medication. But generally speaking, people will like slide back a fair amount. The really interesting thing is if you complete a good course of psychotherapy, the effect of that will last about 2 years on average. So that's something to really, really think about, is that there's a lot of stuff that you can learn with ADHD, if you've got ADHD, that essentially makes the illness not impactful in your life. Does it mean that your brain has changed? Not necessarily. Oftentimes what I see for people who are in sustained remission with ADHD after psychotherapy is they put enough safeguards in place to where the ADHD no longer harms them. So maybe they meditate for a little bit and boost their executive function, but they do things like use calendars, they use reminders, alarms. They develop systems to help us protect against forgetfulness and lateness. So that's what those are the angles that I personally take. That's what's in our guide as well, is like, how do you develop a strategy that will protect you against two things? A structure that will protect you against forgetting and being late. And so that's actually like discrete stuff that you can learn. Just because we teach it in therapy doesn't mean that it is exclusively therapy. So getting organized and using a calendar, like to install a calendar on your phone, you do not need a prescription, right? So a lot of these organizational tools can help anyone. And if you start using these tools, not only can you sort of reduce the impairment of function from ADHD, but you can just get more organized and sort of be more productive in general. So let's keep going, see what else this guy has to say.
Worse than my grandmother's hip. My advice, attach a time limit to every single thing you do. Brushing your teeth, doing homework, a time limit. Not only does it help you keep track of time, but it also makes prioritizing way easier. Because if you try to prioritize in your brain, boom, ADHD paralysis.
So here's the thing. I like this a lot because prioritization is another skill that we don't teach. We don't teach people how to prioritize. And like, it's absolutely a skill that can be done.
Okay, tip number whatever. Since your brain is a wild animal in constant search of stimulation, you gotta make the boring interesting. Try and swerve your research essay into talking about your current hyperfixation. Buy new colored pens. Body double. Invite your friend over. Switch location. Go to the library. I don't care. But you gotta keep it fresh. I'll probably make a part 2.
So I think that this guy's touching on a lot of the like good stuff, honestly. So I think that like if we kind of go back to this, right? We actually, so this is why we make the guide, is like we'll have a lot of these things in here. So how to organize your environment, how to set good goals, how to concentrate. There's a lot of stuff in here that I think if this is once again the shortcoming of TikTok is that the nice thing about TikTok is like in 60 seconds you get kind of a blast of something. But then if you're watching this, what I'm kind of left wondering is what do we do about it now? Right? Like, how do you actually use a system? How do you develop a system like that? Okay.
ADHD really is an upgrade. It gives me an untapped amount of energy to be able to focus on multiple projects at any one time, but it also means that I have a hypersensitivity to boardom. So we've got to stop looking at it as a deficit and we've got to start looking at it as a benefit. ADHD doesn't mean that you can't concentrate for extended periods of time. ADHD in most cases means that you have trouble focusing on things that you're not interested in. Because some people at school, like they can focus on things that are not interesting because they've been told they have to do it. And I was terrible at that stuff because I wasn't interested. So yeah, I think ADHD is a great blessing. Learning how to manage it is really just a process of identify the things that you're interested in and good at, and then having the discipline and the structure to just make.
Wait a minute, what? Just identify the things that you're interested in. Then just have the discipline and structure. Easy. Solved.
Contain that. ADHD really is an upgrade.
I didn't realize it was an upgrade. In order to utilize this upgrade,
and good at, and then having the
just have the discipline and structure to implement it. I wonder if there's a diagnosis out there that makes you highly distractible and difficult for you to implement structure. If your attention is so variable that it's like almost like it's hard to be structured. Like, this would be great. I love this. The only problem is that if you happen to have a diagnosis that makes it hard for you to be able to focus, hard for you to be consistent, hard for you to do things, easy for you to forget, easy for you to get distracted by things, that would make this hard. Right? Yeah, well, luckily this guy doesn't have it. But in all seriousness, I think that, we've been seeing a lot of this recently, where people are sort of talking about ADHD as not an illness. Some people will talk about it like a superpower. I think part of this like discussion of neurotypical versus neuroatypical is a good example of this, where, some people are saying like, I'm not ill, it's who I am. And I think this is where honestly, like Ayurveda does a very, very good job of characterizing this. So the Ayurvedic perspective is that there's some people have a high amount of vata. And the more vata you are, the more dynamic you are. The principles of vata are movement and change. So vata people will get bored easily, but can also adapt to external changes very quickly. So they'll have difficulty with follow through, but will get very, very excited and have large amounts of energy at the very beginning of something. So I think that part of this, what we're sort of seeing is that in Western medicine, we tend to draw a line and we say this is illness or not illness. Whereas if you really look at it, there may be some features of ADHD which can benefit people, right? It's not all bad. I think that this is an important ongoing conversation. I think the unfortunate thing is that if we look at ADHD, we have to remember that a lot of these diagnoses are made kind of in a environmentally sensitive way. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if this was 10,000 years ago and you were a hunter and every day your job was to go out into the wilderness and forage, and you had to pay attention to a ton of stimuli. Is there a footprint there? Is there a bird over there? I think I smell some kind of like animal here. Like, what is this? That would have been fine. The problem is that in current society, like if you're a kid, you go to school, you have to sit in a chair for 8 hours. And so like something about our society does sort of almost makes this variable attention more of a disorder. So I do think that ADHD is a diagnosis. I think it's a diagnosis that it impairs function. I do think that it's not quite as black and white though, right? So I do believe in ADHD as a diagnosis. And I've met some people who have really bad ADHD. And once they get it treated, like they're like, I hate ADHD. I'm so glad it's gone. I can finally live my life now that it's like being treated and it's off the table. It makes my life so like I feel normal. Right. And then for some people, ADHD is really just a difference. And so this is the kind of thing where I'd be really curious about the severity of this person's ADHD. So maybe this person is someone who is like right on the threshold, kind of got diagnosed, but really could have been in either camp. So they can say things like, actually, I've learned how to lean into my high vata. And as a result, it feels like a superpower to me. I think just, the last thing that I'll kind of say is that at the end of the day, the key feature of ADHD is that it's highly variable, right? So you'll have a severity, you'll have different severity. You'll also have different neuroscience circuits that are affected in different people. So some people will have the hyperactivity component. Some people will have the emotional dysregulation component. Some people will be more distractible. Some people will be like, there's just a lot of differences. And even amongst a disorder, it's not all uniform. So if this person resonates with you, then that's okay. Lean into some of the advantages of having a highly flexible mind. At the same time, if you kind of watch this and you're like, this is total BS, like I find it absolutely crippling, that can be your truth too. Because the disease is not, remember that our disease, what we diagnose is a syndrome, right? It's a collection of observations. So anyway, questions? Oh, wow. Oh, Miss Kruthi is gifting subs. Thank you, Miss Kruthi. We appreciate it. Holding Bury 3D sheet, is a guide useful for someone without ADHD? I think so. So like I said, a third of the guide is maybe ADHD focused, and the 2/3 of it is like just teaching people how to focus, concentrate, organize, prioritize, understand their emotions, understand your resistance, your motivation, things like that. Oh my God, we're still linked to Cult of the Lamb. Are ADHD and thought loops related? I find myself trying to find the perfect system to get stuff done instead of just getting it done. I don't know if that's explicitly related to ADHD, but it is a common problem. And so here's what I want y'all to do. I'm going to mention the guide a couple times today, and then we're going to decide at the end, we're going to watch one video together. So, looking for the perfect system goes to this. So we have a video exactly about that, which is I'm not ready. I need the perfect system before I start. So what's going on there? Is it really related to ADHD? I don't know, but it's certainly related to doing stuff. Is the ADHD guide written any different from the other guides, like easier for ADHD brains to get through? Sort of yes and no. So I'd say that, remember, it's a guide also about doing stuff. So it's not like you have to have ADHD to watch the guide. At the same time, we do always try to make things amenable to people who have attentional problems. That's part of the reason for the choose your own adventure, go at your own pace, like watch half the video now. If you get distracted, you can go back and rewatch it. We also try to keep things pretty short, right? So part of the reason that it takes so much effort to produce is that it's actually like quite short, right? So videos will be like 20 minutes long, whereas like on stream, I'll opine about something for like an hour and a half. So we try to keep it short and to the point so that, you know, if you do have a shorter attention span, you can still get through hopefully most of it. What I will say that is a little bit unfortunate is that some of it is quite dense. I just couldn't figure out, like, I don't know how to say this, but like, you know, if you have ADHD and you watch the first neuroscience video, which we can watch together and maybe you guys can tell me, but you know, like you may not get it all the first time. And I did my best to try to make it simple as possible. And I just concluded at the end of it, I rewrote half the guide because I was like, at the end of the day, like you just need to be empowered with this information, even if it's hard to digest. I tried so hard and then ultimately was like, nope, people need to just start learning how their brains work. We teach them how their bodies work. We teach them how to dance and play basketball. And we teach all these things about so many different organs in our body. We need to start learning about the brain, especially if you have ADD. If you're struggling with motivation, you need to understand how all these different parts of your brain actually work. Because then you know, like, why is that? It's because, like, then you know, like, I'm not busted. It's like, oh, this part of my brain is actually wired and is trying to accomplish this goal. The way that my brain is wired and the goals that are accomplishing or trying to accomplish are running against some other goal that I have. So we've tried to make it as accessible as possible. That's part of the reason we have Choose Your Own Adventure. We sort of thought about that when we developed the first ones, right? Go at your own pace. Rewind. That's another reason that we do that instead of kind of streaming, right? So if you stream and you like get distracted, if I'm streaming and say I give a lecture, if I'm streaming and you get distracted and you miss out on 5 minutes, GG, the next hour, like Dr. K is going to be talking about some random thing that I missed out on. So like, that's why we have it in this way so that you could go back and like, you know, rewind, watch it until you get it and then move forward. Okay, so Fake Adults is saying, I had bad ADHD growing up, especially during middle school. As I got older, I've been able to control it. Now I'm 20 and don't feel ADHD affecting me as much. How could I say it's completely gone? So great question. Answered in the guide, but we'll answer it right here. So ADHD is, generally speaking, impacts the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is what plans and executes tasks, is also responsible for things like impulse control, is responsible for delaying gratification, is responsible for all these different things. And what we tend to see in people with ADHD is that their frontal lobes are impaired. As a result, they have difficulty focusing. They have difficulty controlling their impulses. Cool thing is that our frontal lobes develop until we're about 30 or 32. Some people will say 28. I personally think it's 30 to 32. That's probably on the high end. Most people will sort of say they fully develop sometime between, let's say, 26 and 30. So as your frontal lobes naturally grow, some people will actually grow out of ADHD. A lot of people will find that things get easier. But if you look at the data, only about 25% of people will really grow out of ADHD. So take that with a grain of salt. So if you're in the lucky 25%, great. But everyone will get some degree of improvement. And what I've really found is that for a lot of people, like I've really had people who have bad ADHD that once they get good treatment, like they can live a completely normal life. Fluorescent Pickle is saying there are 22-minute videos. Absolutely. Sometimes like it takes 22 minutes. Like, I'm sorry. You guys want 1-minute videos? Go watch TikTok. You know what I'm saying? Like, we do our best, but some of them are long. Yeah. Because sometimes these issues are complex. Like, I don't know, like we have one video on parenting kids with ADHD, and that's one of our longer videos, and it's like 20 some odd minutes. But it turns out that learning how to parent a kid with ADHD takes more than 20 minutes of instruction. We do our best to try to trim it down, but if we had it like 7 minutes, like you couldn't get anything useful there. Great point, though. Does any part of the guide talk about the link between ADHD and dopamine in regards to overeating and other diet issues? Once again, the answer is going to be kind of weird. It's yes and no. So this is why we approach the guide the way that we do. So we teach the fundamentals. So we talk about dopamine, we talk about attention. We also talk about impulse control and addictions. So we don't just talk about alcohol addiction or video game addiction. We talk about the fundamental neuroscience behind impulses and ADHD. So the reason that we approached it that way is to cover all of these fringe issues. So early on when I was writing the guide, I was like, okay, do I need to talk about binge eating? Do I need to talk about this? Do I need to talk about this? Do I need to talk about this? All these different clinical variants. Instead, what I decided is actually, like, for all these different variants, what's the core neuroscience at play? And that's what we choose to talk about. We'll go into some details about particular diagnoses and comorbidities. I don't think binge eating is one of them, but we absolutely have something about, maybe we touch on it, I don't really remember. But that's why we sort of focus on the fundamentals, which is what I think everyone with ADHD needs to be equipped with. Can you talk about ADHD guide included with coaching and coach toolkits for supporting ADHD clients? Sure. So the ADHD guide is included in coaching. So if you guys sign up for coaching, while y'all are in coaching, you'll get access to the guide. Your coach may recommend particular videos for you to watch, or like y'all can do some of the exercises together. The key thing is that the guide will get you so far, but when it really comes to more personal stuff, it really synergizes with coaching. So you can learn, let's say, like, we'll talk about organization and prioritization, for example, or even motivation. The key thing about working with a coach is that you can take those core foundational principles and apply them 100% to your situation. And as you start to try to make progress in your life, you'll run into other kinds of pitfalls. And as you run into obstacles or pitfalls, your coach can help you work through that. To kind of complement the guide, we actually have an even more detailed kind of resource, which is more coach facing. So there's like a toolkit that we've given to all of our coaches to help them be more effective at working with ADHD clients or clients with ADHD-like symptoms. So coaches aren't going to diagnose you, but what we found in our coaching program is that a lot of people have difficulty with distraction. Now, this kind of goes back to this last TikTok that we watched, which is like, oh, ADHD isn't an illness, it's a superpower. Where it's like, what we've noticed is that even if you don't have a formal diagnosis, or even if you've been evaluated and don't get diagnosed, that attentional problems and distractibility and difficulty with organization, difficulty with prioritization, all of these things are becoming more and more important to the digital generation. So our attention is just being pulled in 1,000 different ways, and we're like struggling to keep up. So coaches hopefully can help you with that kind of stuff. And we've equipped them with a special toolkit to specifically help people who, like, have trouble focusing during sessions, for example. So how do you handle that as a coach? What are some tips, techniques, tools that you can use if someone is struggling with, like, prioritizing and things like that? So there's a lot of stuff that they have access to. So our hope is that if people are kind of coming into coaching and want to focus on being able to do stuff, that our coaches will be able to support them in a more, like, neurodivergent way. Okay, so there's a great question. So PoyPal is asking, you mentioned that it shouldn't be expected that ADHD medication solve all symptoms. What would be a reasonable expectation of medication results? A certain threshold of functionality above what you experience without medication. This is a great question. I'm going to illustrate this with a diagram. So what can you expect from ADHD medication? This is probably in the guide, by the way. So this is why we have it, because there's, like, we'll talk about this. But let's talk about it here, because this is where we are. Just while we're waiting for this to load. So, in the guide, we do have a specific section on treatment for children and adults where we talk about medications and what to expect. So if you guys want more detailed versions of that, you can look there. But here's the way to think about it, okay? So if I've got ADHD and I grow up with untreated ADHD, what this will result in is difficulty with socialization, poor performance, either academically or professionally. And then there's the whole host of ADHD symptoms, right? So there's like distractibility, inattention, difficulty with focus, impulsivity. So this is important to understand. So what happens is that this actually leads to these. So for example, kids with ADHD don't get invited to birthday parties as often as neurotypical kids. And so that's because like what happens is like when you're 6 years old and you've got ADHD and everyone is talking about Pokemon and then you start talking about football, everyone's like, what is this kid talking about? So just that inattention, inability to like pay attention in conversations, also some degree of emotional dysregulation. Or if you look at perseveration, right, or hyperfocus. So if I like go to a friend's house and I perseverate with Legos and I'm just completely ignoring the friend, what do you think is going to happen? I'm not going to get invited again. So then what happens is we have difficulty with socialization, we have poor performance, and then miraculously someone comes along and diagnoses you. Yay, diagnosis. Woo. And you get started on medication. And medication will improve all these things. Let's say this happens at the age of 25. The problem is that now you've grown up, and for the last 19 years, you haven't had normal social opportunities. So at this point, you're socially behind. At this point, because you weren't neurotypical, you developed all kinds of bad habits to make it through school. Now the problem is that medication can fix this, but what medication can't fix is all of the consequences of growing up with ADHD. It's not like medication magically gives you like healthier habits. So this is why really when you work with people, what you've really got to do is like fix all this stuff too, in a very intentional way. So that's the real challenge, is that like medication ain't just gonna fix it, unfortunately, as much as I wish it would. Does that answer your question? Great question. Okay. How hard is it to get a diagnosis as an adult with ADHD? So it used to be that some people only made the diagnosis in kids. Thankfully, I think at least in the US, it's pretty easy nowadays. So you'll have neuropsychologists that will do things like do ADHD testing, but it's really a clinical diagnosis. You actually don't even need to get tested for it. That's what a lot of people will do. But a clinician can make the diagnosis based on history. Does completing the guide increase our rank in the cult? Absolutely. Okay. Wow. So many questions. I really appreciate them, chat. Like, this is fantastic. Okay, we've got a couple other things that we want to get through today. So let's do it. Enough of the TikToks. Okay. So. Oh, okay. So I gotta do one more. I've also heard a lot about the red dye, blue dye in drinks and food. Bad or not bad for you? I just love that question, Fake Adults. Wait, Fake Adults is the one who's going to be a psychiatrist, therapist, something like that, right? Did I catch that right? So this is really interesting. So some people did some research, and they found that the likelihood of ADHD appears to be linked to processed foods, and specifically food colorings. And so there was a lot of interest in this early on in the medical community because we were like, oh, we found it. We found out why all the kids have the ADHD. It's because they're eating goldfish crackers that are artificially colored. We figured it out. Eat natural, raw milk, Whole Foods. You know how it is. Sponsored by Amazon. So then what happened is people were like really, really excited by this stuff. And we talk about, we go into detail in the treatment for kids, actually. So we can watch this video if you guys want. But it turns out that larger scale meta-analyses really found that it doesn't seem to have a huge impact. So my interpretation for that is that there may be some kids who are more sensitive to that stuff. But generally speaking, cutting out processed foods and cutting out particular dyes, I don't think you can expect a strong clinical improvement. Unfortunately. Y'all are welcome to, I think we have citations and stuff, so y'all are welcome to, look at those yourself. But a lot of that diet stuff is frankly like, we'll talk about it. That's part of the guide. We go into it. We'll talk about how, like, some people have looked at omega-3 and all kinds of other stuff. Turns out that it just doesn't seem to be that consistently useful. So small trials were very promising. And we were like, we figured it out. And the larger trials are like, yeah, it doesn't seem to make too big of a deal. So I have severe food allergies and I would get ADHD symptoms during allergic reactions. That makes sense. That's not ADHD. So like when you have a full-blown allergic reaction, it's going to affect your brain. So that sort of makes sense. Okay, let's move on. I gotta pause for a second. Someone asked about sleep. Okay. Right by nature. How do you grow out of bad habits after getting medication? Slowly and hopefully with help. Dr. K sleep stream. Okay, let's keep going. We have time for maybe one or two more. Okay. Ooh, oh, whoops. Leaked. Saved. Okay, let's take a look at a couple things. I hate my ADHD son. I know. I'm sorry. I know as his mother I'm supposed to love him no matter what, but I cannot stand the little brat, no matter how hard I try. He is the literal definition of a troublemaker. He brings nothing good to our family. My son is 8 years old. He is diagnosed with ADHD and ODD. Whew. Terrible combination to deal with. He does not listen or do what he's told. He has broken boundaries over several occasions. He never follows the rules. It's taken emotional, physical, and financial toll on his father and I and the rest of the family. We can no longer visit family for the holidays because he is out of control. I can't even take him to a damn Walmart for errands because he's wandering around touching whatever he can find. He has caused us thousands of dollars in damages from throwing rocks or eggs at other people's cars, especially when our apartment is directly next to the freeway. He has caused at least 2 car accidents on the interstate. I cannot spend a week without having the cops called on him for random things, including smacking a neighbor's truck to set off the car alarm. He doesn't understand when you tell him no. Actually, he will not take no for an answer. He will get violent and destructive when he's mad. He loves to kick, scream, bite, and make a scene when things don't go his way. He broke every expensive thing I had, including the Samsung TV we bought last week. I can't take him to a Walmart without him acting up. Every time we go, he always wants a random thing off the shelf. He will touch things. He will open up toys, and I have to pay for them each time. Look away for a second and he's gone. I had to invest in a leash to keep him at my side. When I tell him he can't have a toy, candy, whatever, he will scream like a banshee and break things and throw things. This is after I told him not to touch anything in the store and not to ask for anything. I tried everything. Punishments, timeouts, taking away toys and video games, spankings. They don't work. I've tried parenting tips online. None of them work. Medications did work until I complained to the doctor that he was acting like a zombie. I regret not opening my mouth about it. It sounds like she regrets opening her mouth about it. Trying to find medications that work. Fighting with insurance to cover his doctor visits and medications every month. I can't. It's too much for me. School started 3 weeks ago and he was suspended from school twice for violent behavior. I just want to lock myself away and throw away the key. This kid is too much. I'm asking the world of him. I'm not asking the world of him. I just want him to behave and sit quietly like a good kid and not cause us or anything else trouble. So, as a parent, we're supposed to love our kids. And sometimes they do things like they'll do thousands of dollars worth of damage. We can't take them to run errands. They get suspended. We get the cops called. And even as a parent, we have to cope by putting the child on a leash. And then if you're a parent and you walk around outside of the house with an 8-year-old child on a leash, imagine the looks that you get. Oh my God, how terrible is this parent? And so as parents, we're just taught that, like, hey, unconditional love for a child, right? You're supposed to love your child. Like, you're not allowed to hate them. And so since we're not allowed to hate them, and children are perfect and they're innocent, right? And they're 8 years old, can this child really know what he's even doing? And then what we do is we diagnose them with something. We give them an illness. And so then what happens if you're a parent is, like, once your child has this ADHD illness, it's even harder to hate them, right? Because, like, oh, the child is sick. Their brains are different. Like, it's not their fault. This is just the way that they're wired. And so it's really hard having a child with ADHD. So a couple of interesting facts and figures for you. The first thing to understand is that we assume that our parenting affects our child, right? That it's a one-way relationship. That, like, if my child grows up to be a productive human being, that is because I did a good job as a parent. And if my child grows up to be like a little POS who's bothering people and goes to jail, then it's my fault as a parent. We think about parenting as a one-directional relationship. My patience, my dedication, my intelligence, the research that I do, my emotional temperament will result in the child being healthy or unhealthy, successful or unsuccessful. The first thing to understand if you are parenting a child with ADHD is that it's bi-directional. There's overwhelming evidence that children with ADHD induce changes in parenting style. There's strong evidence that having a child with ADHD increases the risk of depression in parents, increases the stress level of parents, right? So the child will affect you as well. And what do I mean by bi-directional? So I'll give you all a simple example. Parents of children with ADHD yell at their kids more than parents of kids without ADHD. And what happens is when you go out to, like, let's say a grocery store and you see some parent losing their shit with a kid, yelling at their 8-year-old child, you're like, oh my God, what a terrible parent. So here's what happens. So I'll explain it to you, okay? So when I have ADHD, I'm highly distractible and I can be very perseverative. So if I start to do something, this is what happens in our brain. When we're focused on something, there is some part of our brain that is paying attention to other stimuli, right? So like if I'm sitting there, let's say playing a video game, and there's a fire in the next room, and smoke starts coming into the room and I smell it, there's a circuit in my brain that takes a very, very faint smell of smoke. Very faint. It's not like the fire's in my room. Takes that signal and then shatters my attention and says, hey, stop playing the video game. Pay attention to there's some smell of smoke here. So if we kind of look at it, if my mind is focused on A, how strong does the stimulus have to be to break that attention? So in a neurotypical person, that stimulus is small. So if you're like sitting at home and like someone is yelling outside, like, oh, you can't focus because you can't drown out that noise, right? So here's the thing. If you have a child with ADHD, you need a very, very strong stimulus to get their attention. So if you say, hey, it's time for school, the child will not even process that information. Hey, it's time for school. No processing. Hey, it's time for school. You say it the third time. Now you get frustrated as a parent. And you say, hey, it's time for school. And then the kid snaps out of it and looks at you. Now, mind you, this is like a 4-year-old kid or even 3-year-old kid, right? Or even 2-year-old kid where you're like, hey, don't pick up the knife. And you have to yell at them to get their attention. So what parents will learn because of this kind of attentional block and the hyperfocus that children have, parents learn to raise their voice. This is actually the effective method of communication for kids with ADHD. But when you yell, it activates certain parts of your sympathetic nervous system. You kind of get emotional, you get angry. It's hard to yell at people and like not have some kind of negative emotion. Furthermore, the kid gets yelled at, right? So like they don't hear anything except for yelling, but it's still startling for a kid to get yelled at. And then they're getting yelled at all the time because that's the effective way of communicating. That's what parents with kids with ADHD learn, is yelling is the only thing that works. Now, this isn't the kid's fault, and it's also not the parent's fault. This is what we've learned when you look at parenting with ADHD, is that ADHD induces changes in parenting. Now, this situation is even worse because now we have oppositional defiant disorder at play. And oppositional defiant disorder is basically anytime you tell me to do something, it's not really about me getting something. It's not about what I want. The defiance is, I just don't want to do what you want. I don't even care about the Legos, but if you tell me to put them away, I'm not going to. So when you get oppositional defiant disorder coupled with ADHD, it's a real mess. Sometimes this can also cross into conduct disorder, which is what we call antisocial personality disorder in adults, which is like sociopathy, for example. So it can be a really bad mess because what you have is oppositional defiance, which sometimes has difficulty with emotional regulation. And then we also know that the brains of people with ADHD, they're more sensitive to negative emotions. So they also can sometimes experience emotional dysregulation. So when you have this kind of situation, it's very hard to deal with. So as a parent, like the first thing that I want to say is like, it's okay. It's okay for you to have feelings of hatred towards your child. Just because you hate your child does not mean that you also don't love your child. That the situation that y'all are in is very, very, very difficult. And this is the other thing that I think is really important to understand. Just because someone is ill doesn't mean that doesn't absolve them of all responsibility. And I've learned this lesson the hard way as a psychiatrist. That we want to have compassion, for example, for people with like bipolar disorder and ADD. Like we want to have compassion for them. We should have compassion for them, and I encourage you to have compassion for them. It's important to remember, though, that people with, let's say, bipolar disorder, and I think about bipolar disorder because that's really like a couple of patients that I really learned this lesson with, they're also somewhat responsible. Right? So I don't really buy that your 8-year-old, sometimes they're emotionally dysregulated, sometimes they're distracted, sometimes they're impulsive, but sometimes they actually know exactly what they're doing. Sometimes they know full well what's going on and they choose to do it anyway. And I think it's really important to assign some responsibility to the child, because until you assign some responsibility to the child, you can't ever expect them to like help you fix this. And that's the key thing. If you're really struggling with a child with ADHD, you need the child's help. You can't parent your way to success without the child's help. And what we tend to see in situations like this is there's a very antagonistic relationship between you and the child. And if you hate your child, how do you think your child feels about you? They hate you too, right? This is a mutual thing that both of y'all are carrying. There's conflict and there's a war between parent and child. And hatred, is it an unfortunate emotion to have in a parent-child relationship? Absolutely. But it is also a completely acceptable emotion and something that can be dealt with, right? It's reasonable to sometimes hate our kids because sometimes they're little brats, right? They do that sometimes. Now, I'm not saying that you should let the hatred run wild. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have compassion. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to change things. But I think you're allowed to feel some hatred, and just because you feel hatred doesn't necessarily mean you also don't feel love. So now the hardest question is what to do about it, because this parent sort of says, I've tried everything and nothing works. And so the biggest thing that I would sort of suggest in a situation like this, and I got to first start by saying no suggestions from the internet will do any justice to your problem. But what I found in the most difficult cases of people with ADD, antisocial personality disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, okay? So I'm talking about adults as well, or even things like bipolar disorder, is that you can't win without the person's help. And so what I tend to see, especially in kids with ADHD by the time they're 8 or 9, is that they're so incapable of responsibility at 4, 5, or 6 that as a parent, we don't give them any responsibility because they can't handle it. And then what happens is that they get to this point where they're 8 years old and they can actually handle a little bit of responsibility. But since we never gave it to them when they're 4, like developmentally, like their brains can handle it, but they haven't learned how to do that. So I know it sounds kind of weird, but what I found to be really, really effective is to really like ask the kid, hey, why are you doing this? What do you think is going on here? When we go to Walmart, are you allowed to open the toys? Can you open the toys? Can you not open the toys? What happens? Are you supposed to open the toys? Why aren't you supposed to open the toys? I know it sounds kind of bizarre, and I'm not saying that this is going to work in this situation, but if you're a kid, if you're a parent with a kid with ADHD, what I oftentimes see parents doing, and I've had a lot of success with this, is they try to control the child, right? The kid doesn't listen. What I don't hear is does the kid understand or do they not understand? Well, they don't listen. When I tell them to do something, they don't listen. Well, do they understand? Well, yeah, I've explained that to them 1,000 times. Hold on a second. Do they understand? And I want you to think about this. If you have ADHD, think about all the times when you were growing up and your parents told you to do something. How often did you really understand what they were trying to get you accomplished and why they were telling you to do it that way? Because what we tend to see is ADHD induces an authoritarian parenting style. So it induces a parenting style that's my way or the highway. And so the more authoritarian you become as a parent, the more you yell, the more it's like, no more opening toys at Walmart. End of story. Explanation and understanding go completely out the window, right? You'll try to explain things. That's where I use a different technique, which is ask your kids questions. Why are we going to Walmart? What are we supposed to do there? What do you like about Walmart? What do you dislike about Walmart? How do you feel when you don't get a toy that you want? Is it possible to go to Walmart and you not to open a toy? Do you think you could handle that? Right? We're not telling them to do it or not do it. What do you think you're capable of? Because here's what I've also seen with kids who are oppositional defiant is if you can ever get them on your side, that stubbornness will start working for you. It's not easy to do, don't get me wrong. So it's not like one conversation has this. But in the situations where I've worked with families, so usually this is like families with video game addiction and some comorbid attention deficit disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. So usually they come to me because there's a problematic behavior in the household where the kid is throwing a temper tantrum because of games or like it's bedtime and they like start flipping chairs, right? I've seen a lot of broken objects, things like that. There's all kinds of stuff that gets messed up. So we don't really see this in this kind of situation, but I've seen it a lot. And what I tend to find is that once again, the most important thing that most people miss is building an alliance with the child and trying to really figure out what does the child understand. Now, if you're saying I've explained that to them 1,000 times, that's not how you recognize understanding. You ask questions. So I'd start by asking your kid lots and lots and lots of questions. And the more that you ask them questions, the more you see what they understand. You're also modeling a different kind of behavior there. Because think about this for a second. If I have a kid who goes into Walmart and starts opening up toys, what do? Hey, you can't do that. Stop. Not allowed. Punishments. What are you modeling for the child? You're actually modeling my way or the highway. Think about it, right? Because there's absolutely no way that you can open up a toy at Walmart without paying for it. I don't care what your opinion is. No means no. No means no. And so what is the child learning? Child is learning no means no. So when mom tells me to put the toy away, mom, no means no. I'm not going to put the toy away. No means no, because that's what you've taught me. So I'm learning it. And that couples with the oppositional defiance, enhances it. Now is not only is the child ODD plus ADHD, now the child is modeling my way or the highway. And sorry, the parent is modeling my way or the highway, which is exactly what the child learns. So this is, I know it's kind of like weird, and it's easy for me to say this like I'm some dude on the internet, right? Like I don't have to parent your kid. Easy for me to say. You got to talk to the kid. You got to understand the kid. And if you know anyone who's like an adult who has ADHD, talk to them too. What was it like growing up with ADHD? How did your parents respond to you? How did it make you feel? Were you rebellious? Tell me about that. And what you'll discover is that like all that stuff is tied together. Last thing to kind of mention is that this is a situation where, unfortunately, I think too much of psychiatric care around this stuff is medication focused, and not enough of it is about communication and boundary setting, like teaching parents these parenting skills. So the first thing that I'd say is that if you're in a situation like this, you yourself need therapy to deal with those negative emotions, process that kind of stuff, process the guilt, recognize that like you're not a bad parent just because you hate your kid, right? Like they're little brats sometimes, and that's okay. You can love your kid and hate your kid. So you got to kind of like work through that stuff on your own. Second thing is strongly recommend some kind of therapy with someone who really understands ADHD and ODD defiant kids. Medication ain't going to cut it. And I totally understand that sometimes what we'll try to do is we'll like medicate them to compliance, which I don't think is a good strategy. The good news, the last thing that I'll sort of say is it may sound really simple, but don't give up hope, because I know you've tried everything, but like, I don't know if this makes sense, but the way that you've tried everything is with your stressed out brain. And that's where like, once you've tried everything and like, you're so stressed out, you can't be patient, and then like things don't work. So then what I'd sort of recommend is once you kind of take care of yourself, you like revisit things, and you may be surprised because each month that goes by, your child's brain develops a little bit more. Each month that goes by, you may learn something. So they may be capable of things a year from now that they weren't capable of 2 years from now. So it's an ongoing process, and don't give up. It's okay to dislike your kid because sometimes they're little brats. And like, good luck, because it ain't easy. Questions? Okay. Yeah, so I see that Kanziat is responding to a question. Thank you very much for doing that, Kanziat. We've interviewed parents on stream, so I encourage y'all to go watch that if y'all want. Adkar is saying, are some kids truly hopeless? I don't believe so. I'm not saying they aren't, but I don't believe so. I've just seen too many hopeless kids, hopeless patients, hopeless people get better. I'm not saying that there has to be someone out there who's hopeless. Like, I've certainly had some patients in my practice that I haven't been able to help substantially. But I don't know if that's like a deficiency of me as a provider or like the case is hopeless. Does that make sense? So I think as a provider, like as a doctor, like I got to be super careful to say like a patient is hopeless. Because that's like one of the most arrogant things that I can say, because it implies that I'm doing everything right. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying there aren't people that I can't help. Like, I think there are people out there that are hard to help. But is it a shortcoming of me? Or are they so sick it's hopeless? I mean, there's some illnesses out there that are terminal. So if you want to call that hopeless, definitely you can say that. But in psychiatry, I mean, I've seen too many success stories that have made me... I just don't think it's like logical to be as hopeless. And when people feel hopeless, I think it's completely logical for them because they haven't seen it yet. Right? So gaming comics say, what about when parent has undiagnosed or untreated ADHD? Well, like, so that's the cool thing, right? So if you look at a situation that you call hopeless and the parent has undiagnosed ADHD, well, like, that's a pretty easy fix. Like, get the parent treatment and then, like, things can turn around real quick. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So I'll have, like, a hopeless kid. And then what we realize is, like, oh, like, maybe the parent has undiagnosed anxiety. So I've seen even kids that were really, really struggling. Turned out, like, one of their parents had really bad undiagnosed OCD, which can be crippling. And, like, a year after the parent got into treatment, kid was doing way better. Okay. Do you think it's bad for my 4-year-old to never take a nap during the day? No. I think kids are different. The important thing is that they get sufficient sleep. Some kids sleep longer overnight. Some kids take naps. All right. We got time for maybe one more. So let's do that one, and then we will watch something. Okay, I'll give you all a choice. We can talk about ADHD. Do you meditate before or after taking your stimulant? So meditation and ADHD. Y'all need to hear this. ADHDers use strong negative emotions to motivate ourselves. So we can talk about that. Or we can talk about this. Sure, I could answer your email and instantly forget about it, or I could leave it unanswered, such that it lives in my mind, exerting a slow daily pressure, and I feel your spectral presence always beside me for countless weeks, and in a way, wouldn't you prefer it that way? I know one is more meme heavy than the others, but let's go ahead and take a quick poll. Mod check. Otherwise, Dr. K will run his own poll. Don't worry, we're going to poll, chat. We're going to poll. I just have to figure out what... Here we go. Team mom or team kid? That was great. Okay. So here is the poll. What do? We can do meditation and meditation on stimulants. We can do, what was the second one? Oh, yeah. Negative emotions as motivation. Okay. There's a character limit. And then the third one was what? Oh, yeah. Task train. What do, chat? Help me, chat. Help me. I did it. I did it, Trinian. Sag. Okay. I was hoping we would do the meditation on stimulants one, but y'all get to pick, so we'll do that one. I think y'all picked right. It's just the one that I was the least excited about, but that's okay. It's not about me, chat. It's not about me. They're all good. They're all good. This is probably the one that makes the world a better place. So let's take a look. Okay? All right. So, y'all need to hear this. ADHDers use strong negative emotions to motivate ourselves. So I was reading this book, Your Brain's Not Broken, by Tamara Rosier, and explains the most effed up shit. Oh, whoops. About how ADHDers motivate themselves using intense emotions, since we can't motivate like neurotypicals. As you know, we are motivated by interest rather than importance and consequences. So how do we get the day-to-day stuff done in order to function? Here we go. Anxiety. We rely on anxiety to tell us what needs to be done. Did I lock my car? What happened if I accidentally unlocked it? My stuff would get stolen. I can't buy a new one. Lock car, lock car, lock car. It is like we inject strong emotions like fight or flight into ourselves, but the thing is they can linger after. Oh, wait, I just locked the car, right? Yeah. Oh, I'm worried. Oh, gosh. And that's mentally taxing. Anger. Getting mad in order to fuel ourselves to do the task. The book gives an example of this guy whose mother was angered by his behavior, and when no one else was around to yell at me, I learned to yell at myself. As you can imagine, this is not healthy and it leads to exhaustion and crankiness. Shame and self-loathing. An intense feeling of flawed, of unworthy of love. To start, I imagine how disappointed my supervisor would be if I don't finish on time. She will realize she shouldn't have given me the job in the first place. I have to get this right or I'll screw up my kids for the rest of their life. So we are rehearsing different ways we are damaged, incompetent, and stupid. There's more in the book, but these are really the top 3 that I found crazy. We use anxiety, anger, and shame to fuel the motivation deficit, and neurotypicals have naturally, and it can come at a cost. So I really like this post for a lot of reasons, and there are some things that I would sort of disagree with. The first thing that I really like is that it shows how having ADHD and negative emotions can synergize in some ways. What I dislike about it is that I think it once again oversimplifies into attributing all of these things to ADHD. So this isn't just true of people with ADHD, this is true of everyone. Where if we kind of think about it, why do human beings have negative emotions, right? Let's just start there. Let's start by recognizing that anxiety, shame, and anger are not exclusive to people with ADHD. These are conserved across the entire human race. And why is that? It's because they are very, very useful emotions. So in today's society, we tend to think about negative emotions as negative, right? It's like, I want to feel a lot of excitement. I want to feel a lot of joy. I want to feel a lot of curiosity, but I don't want anxiety. I don't want anger. I don't want shame. Those are bad emotions, and those are to be avoided. But let's remember that if they didn't do something for us, we wouldn't have evolved them. And it turns out that the negative emotions are actually very, very powerful motivators. In fact, they're stronger motivators than positive emotions. So let's just understand that for a second. So the first thing to get is that our brain is more sensitive to negative things than positive things. This is a bias that's baked in. So for example, let's say I get dressed up and I go to a party and I'm wearing a fancy dress. And 9 people walk up to me and say, Dr. K, that's a beautiful dress. You look great in it. You're really rocking the dress, bro. And then one person walks up to me and is like, you look absolutely ridiculous. What on earth are you doing wearing a dress? It looks terrible. Now, in my mind, I've gotten 9 compliments and 1 person has criticized. Which one do I focus on? I tend to focus on the criticism, right? So I've also seen this in especially kids that are South Asian or East Asian, where their parents will focus on, like, it doesn't matter like how much I get right. All that matters is what I didn't get right, or that someone else does a better job than I do. It's like, you got 92 on the test, but our neighbor across the street, their kid got a 98. Why can't you get a 98? Why do you have to get a 92? And so even like culturally, we'll be conditioned to focus on the negative, right? We'll see that a lot. And so if you kind of think about this, where does this come from? I sort of use food poisoning as a good example. So if we weren't biased towards the negative, like let's say that like I got food poisoning from eating something, right? If I got food poisoning 40% of the time, but it was fine 60% of the time, I would be in a lot of trouble if I kept eating it. Because even though technically 60% of the time I'm fine, that's more than half. On average, it's a good idea for me to eat. But the consequences of making that negative mistake are so high that even if you really think about it, if you go to your favorite restaurant and you get food poisoning once, it's actually like hard to go back there, right? And so what we tend to see is that the brain is biased towards the negative, that we weigh the negative more powerfully than the positive. And so what this results in is some of us who struggle with motivation have one really powerful tool to motivate ourselves, and that's negative emotion. And this isn't just kids with ADHD. So you'll see this, for example, in medical students, where some med students, or most med students, are high on neuroticism. So this is one of the 5-factor personality dimensions. And neuroticism is the tendency to worry. And so people may think, like, why on earth would a tendency to worry be a good thing? Like, why would we even have people who have a tendency to worry? Well, it turns out that if you're worried about failing a test, you're going to study harder. And that fear of failing can make you actually work harder and actually outperform people who are kind of chill. So on the one hand, we have the paranoid medical student who's or paranoid pre-med who wants to go to medical school. And on the flip side, we have our classic stoner personality, plus or minus marijuana, whatever. We've got someone who's like, everything will be okay, right? We're not even saying that it's marijuana related. We've just got people who are like that, they have that personality where they're like, I'm just chilling, like live for today. Don't worry about tomorrow. Everything works itself out. And the pre-med is the one who gets an A. The person who's pretty chill will get like a B+, B-, right? Because on Friday night, one of them's out having a good time. The other one's actually at the library studying. So what we tend to see is that actually negative motivators, what I call the dirty motivators. So I kind of think of them kind of like nuclear power, where like they harness a bunch of energy, but they're radioactive. And if you're not careful, they'll damage your life, right? You can succeed, but you won't be happy or content in doing so. I see that a lot also in like the fields of like finance and stuff like that, where you'll see a lot of imposter syndrome. So people who use dirty motivators will experience a lot of imposter syndrome as well. So I'll give you all, like, let's just take a quick look at this. So if you use shame or self-loathing, oh my God, like, I'm going to do so bad at this. Let me try my best, even though I'm unworthy of it. And then you end up feeling damaged, incompetent, or stupid, but you do well enough in school, right? Because you're beating yourself up all the time. Then you'll actually succeed and you go to medical school. And then when someone has used shame and self-loathing to motivate themselves and they get into medical school or they wind up in residency at Harvard, what do they end up feeling like? They end up feeling like an imposter. An imposter is someone who has shame and self-loathing on the inside, but performs well on the outside. And we're seeing a growing level of imposter syndrome across society as a whole. And I think part of the reason for that is because we're using shame and self-loathing as motivators. Now, out of these 3 specific things, I think the anxiety one is the best. That's ADHD specific. So the anxiety one really illustrates how we can use anxiety as an antidote to forgetfulness. So in the brain of someone who's got ADHD, they're highly distractible. They also tend to be forgetful. But really, if you look at it, it's not that they have memory problems, it's that they have attentional problems. So when I forgot where my keys are, it's not that I knew where my keys are and then I had a memory problem. What it actually happens is I'm not paying attention when I put them down. So this is important to understand, but it's not the recall that is impaired with people with ADHD. It's the insertion of the information. It's the, like, we don't write it to the hard drive well enough. Like, that's where the real problem is. It's inattention, not a lack of, not really a memory problem. But we can still see how anxiety can be an antidote to that. So when I'm anxious, if I've trained my brain to be paranoid, then I won't forget because I'm always worrying about it. Because what can protect me against forgetting? If I'm always worried about it. And even if it's okay, I've trained myself to always worry because I can't trust my memory, right? So I'm always worrying, always worrying, always worrying. And this is what you see in people with ADHD is that they develop adaptive mechanisms which are harmful to them over the long term. So this is why, for example, people with ADHD have a very high risk of depression. Children with ADHD have a very high risk of developing major depressive disorder later in life. So these kids grow up and they struggle in school. They forget all the time, things like that. They develop some self-esteem issues. So that too, I think this isn't directly a consequence of ADHD. This is usually what happens when you have a kid with ADHD, is they look around at other kids and they realize I'm just as smart as these other kids are. They're told by their teachers, they're told by parents, you're so smart. You have so much potential. So I know I've got the IQ, but then I can't perform in school. So I can't get an A because I get distracted. I can't pay attention. There's a really classic case that I kind of think of, which is that teacher asks the kid, hey, are you paying attention? Answer the question. And the kid wasn't paying attention. They look around, they see a problem on the board, They look around, everyone's looking at them. Okay, we're in math class. There's a problem on the board. I see that these other 3 problems have answers. This one doesn't have an answer. Let me answer that question. Okay, this is the answer. And they say it. The teacher kind of looks at them with skepticism, writes the answer on the board, and moves on. This inattention makes it very difficult to function in school. Everyone recognizes your potential, but you don't live up to it. And then everyone says, oh, you should just try harder. Doesn't apply himself, doesn't apply herself, doesn't live up to her full potential. And so then what happens is you start to feel broken if you have ADHD. Because you recognize that I'm just as smart as these kids. When I pay attention, I'm able to learn just as fast as they do. But I'm not able to pay attention. And no one recognizes that my problem is a lack of attention. It's like exactly what happens. Imagine a child who goes to school, is super smart, but needs glasses and can't read because they don't have glasses. How would that child feel about themselves if no one recognized that, oh, the problem is the kid needs glasses? The child would stumble, adapt, do all kinds of stuff to just be average. They exert so much effort to just perform at an average level. And they end up feeling terrible about themselves. Because what they see is, I'm trying hard. I try hard every single day. I'm trying so hard. And if the best I can do is average, how screwed up must I be? Because everyone says I could do great, but I can't do great. And I'm trying so hard. So they develop self-loathing. Now, is this a direct consequence of ADHD? I don't think so. I think this is the consequence of undiagnosed and untreated ADHD and growing up in that situation. So this is important to understand that you've got to differentiate those out a little bit. And the reason that's important is because once you treat the ADHD, some of this may go away, but this won't. A stimulant medication isn't going to fix this. This needs independent treatment, right? In psychotherapy or something like that. Now, anger is a really interesting example because we do know, for example, that emotional dysregulation is common in people with ADHD. I think that people with ADHD can sometimes have low frustration tolerance. They can kind of perseverate, and if they get disturbed, they can respond with anger. There's some evidence that given the same stimuli, people with ADHD will feel more anger. But that, once again, I think you've got to be kind of careful because I don't know that that's necessarily an adaptive mechanism like the other two. I think sometimes people with ADHD just experience more anger and frustration and have difficulty with frustration tolerance. That has something to do with probably the way that their frontal lobes struggle to inhibit the negative emotional circuitry in the brain. So for a neurotypical person, if I experience some amount of anger, there's another part of my brain that's like telling me, okay, calm down, take a deep breath, let's not lose control. And that's the part of the brain that really doesn't function very well in people with ADHD or some people with ADHD. Now, what all human beings will tend to do in that situation is like, if I'm going to be angry anyway, let's make the most of it. So people with ADHD will develop some adaptive strategies, but I think anger is a little bit different. Just to kind of summarize, I think it's really unfortunate, but oftentimes people with ADHD will experience high levels of negative emotion. In the case of anxiety, sometimes that's almost an adaptive mechanism to make up for being forgetful, distractible, or not paying attention to things. Other examples of the negative emotions they experience aren't necessarily adaptations per se, but are consequences of frequently growing up without a diagnosis or treatment of ADHD. And the important thing there is that if we say that self-loathing is a part of the ADHD, then treating the ADHD should fix the self-loathing. But in my experience as a clinician, it doesn't work like that. That you can treat the ADHD, but you need to deal with the self-esteem and self-loathing independently. And the last emotion is anger, which in my experience, a lot of times people just get dysregulated very easily. I don't know that it's necessarily adaptive. Maybe a portion of that is adaptive. But understand that part of ADHD is to be unable to regulate your emotions. And then as most people with ADHD do, they'll adapt to those circumstances as best they can. Maybe use that anger to manage social situations, maybe use that anger to even beat themselves up a little bit. And then what we do know is that people tend to internalize the dialogue that is used with them. That has nothing to do with ADHD. That's just how we all work. So you can take a kid in an abusive situation, whether they have ADHD or don't have ADHD, If they're given abusive language, they will internalize those thoughts and have self-esteem problems later. At the end of the day, I do think it's really, really important to understand the connection between ADHD and emotions, and hopefully we've sort of illustrated that a little bit today. Questions? Okay, if someone got diagnosed in the middle of professional school, yeah, so this is a great question. So like, if you're an adult and you're busy adulting, how do you have time for like ADHD treatment? What a great question. It's tough. So even if you don't have ADHD, like who's running around with like piles and piles of excess time? No one, right? Like no one has tons of free time. So the challenge is that you really got to make time. So what I tend to find is that with my patients, for example, like so many of them are very busy and they make the time. And like you can make the time. You just have to really work at it. And I think what a lot of times people will discover, especially when it comes to ADHD, is that 1 hour of ADHD treatment is worth like 3 hours. Like you gain 3 hours with the benefit that you get from your ADHD. So if you look at the cost of untreated ADHD in terms of your time, it's very high, right? Like reading one chapter will take you 8 hours. Whereas if you're on treatment, like let's say medication, or you learn how to like focus and organize and prioritize, then you kind of end up like doing that work in an hour and a half. It's great. So over time, you'll really benefit from it. And I'd say just structure it into your day as best as you can, but it feels really hard at the beginning. Is there a correlation between OCD and ADHD? It's one of the weaker ones. So there is some evidence that they're correlated, but we know, for example, that growing up with untreated ADHD has a much, much stronger chance of developing into a mood disorder than it does into developing into OCD. So people with ADHD are very vulnerable to addictions or substance use disorders, more so than OCD. That's why we tend to focus on those things. Keino Uta is saying ADHD in the female cycle, Dr. K, what do we know? By female cycle, you mean menstrual cycle? Actually, I don't know. I haven't really looked at that in a bunch of detail, but I'm going to now. Thank you for the question. Any idea what type of therapy is best for crippling self-esteem issues and anxiety? Any kind of therapy. Personally, I would recommend, like if one of my friends came to me and had crippling self-esteem issues, I would recommend a more a psychodynamic approach. But if you're really like, it depends on what your goals are. Like, are your goals to have a good sense of yourself, or your goals to be able to like go to a party 12 weeks from now? If your goal is like, I want to go to a party in 8 weeks, then I would say go see a CBT therapist. If you want to feel better about yourself and feel secure in who you are a year from now, I'd say go see a psychodynamic therapist. Honestly, the best advice is go see 3 different therapists with 3 different styles and pick the one that you like the best. That's the right answer. Okay. So any idea what the link would be between things like trauma, ADHD, OCD? So it's great that you're asking this question. I wonder if you're asking this question. So I don't know if you all saw this, but so, you know, we talked about, hold on a second. So we talked about a lot of different stuff today in terms of ADHD and how it impacts people. So this is why we made Dr. K's guide, to answer all these questions. Like, what's the relationship between ADHD and our emotions, right? So that's over here. How does the neuroscience of motivation work? What's the relationship between dopamine and technology usage and ADHD? And so if you guys want like more details about all of this stuff, how does ADHD affect self-loathing and self-esteem? How does ADHD affect my relationships? How does ADHD affect parenting? We've talked about so many different things today, and that's why we built this guide, is just to help y'all answer all of these questions in a lot of detail. Because honestly, these are not simple problems with like 5-minute tips, like 3 tips to parent better with your kids with ADHD. Like you'll get some benefit there, but sometimes you need more detail. And if that's really what you're looking for, if you're looking for stuff that's like practically applicable, you know, like more in detail, kind of more comprehensive, then that's really what the guide is for. So definitely check it out if that interests you. What we're going to do now is actually watch one video. So what do y'all want to watch? We can watch one. We're going to stream. So Top of the Dome, are you familiar with Gabor Mate's work? I'm a big fan of Gabor Mate. Let me see if I can find my Gabor Mate book. Yeah, here it is. So when I finished residency and I was working in a drug rehab, this book was fantastic. So I'm a huge fan of Gabor Mate's work. I've seen some of his stuff on ADHD. I think I generally agree with a lot of it. I think he does a good job at really thinking about dimensions outside of clinical work. Like sometimes we over pathologize like medicine, which is kind of duh, right? But I think especially in the field of psychiatry, there's so much that there's so much about our specific field, which like transcends into the human condition. And I think sometimes what we've got to do is, there was actually a really interesting New York Times article recently about the scope creep of therapy. And someone was talking about how like therapists are doing all kinds of stuff that they're like not supposed to be doing anymore. It's a really interesting article written by a clinical psychologist, where if you look at, especially like this is happening a lot with the third wave of therapies. So as we incorporate things like mindfulness and like these Eastern principles into psychotherapy because they have clinical benefits, we're starting to become non-clinical in nature. It's a really interesting take. So I think that there's always this tension between what is the line of like what psychotherapy is supposed to do. What do y'all want to, okay, let's do poll. I need options. So we can vote getting overwhelmed, okay? You guys, okay, we'll do it. We can do a meditation. Parenting. Which one? Technology habits? That's about how to build healthy technology habits. Resistance. Neuroscience. Okay. Let's vote. The parenting, the neuroscience one is hype. I don't know that it's gonna help a bunch of people, but I think the neuroscience one really showcases why a guide is like good. And also, I maybe that's just the one. Don't be biased by me though. It's just the one that I'm the most anxious about in terms of like, is this way too much for people? The reason I'm biased towards the neuroscience one, y'all pick whatever you want, but the reason I'm biased towards the neuroscience one is because it's the one thing that I could never do on stream. Everything else I could do on stream. So like if we're going to watch something on stream, the neuroscience one is the only thing that I could just like, and that's why it's like, I'm like, yeah, we should do that one because I could never do it on stream. Okay, but I biased the vote. My apologies, everybody. So for those of you that voted for something else, I apologize. I'm going to do my best not to bias things. In my experience, I think this is the first time that I've biased a vote. Y'all are still voting. You've convinced me. Okay. All right, we're going to do neuroscience. Let's go, chat. This is going to be weird because I'm going to hear my own voice. All right. So, now remember, so there's a disclaimer about this video, okay? Which is that this is the introductory neuroscience video. So we go into everything that we're going to talk about here in a lot more detail. So if you watch this video and you're like, I don't really understand what's going on, that's okay. Because in the next videos, we'll explain more and apply it. But let's see. Next up, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of ADHD. So remember that ADHD is a syndrome, right? So it's a constellation of symptoms. And so you don't have to have every symptom in the diagnostic and statistics manual for ADHD. Some people will have some symptoms, other people will have other symptoms. So as a clinician, one of the things that I found is very, very helpful is to really understand which are the particular vulnerabilities that a patient with ADHD has. And if we understand what those vulnerabilities are, and we understand kind of how they work and where they come from, we can also develop a very tailored plan to kind of combat their ADHD and sort of bring them up to speed or restore some of their function. So this is where we're going to start with neuroscience. And I know this is going to be complicated, but I spent a lot of time learning this stuff, which means that you're going to spend a lot of time learning it too. And it ain't necessarily going to be easy, but I do think that it's going to be very, very helpful. So the cool thing about the neuroscience of ADHD is that a lot of the deficits that we see actually map onto the brain. And once we understand what's going on in the brain, it gives us a roadmap for how to fix things. So let's start by looking at a couple of the regions of the brain that are involved in ADHD. So the first region that we're going to talk about is the amygdala. And the amygdala is our negative emotional center of the brain, and is also our survival center of the brain. So it's where we experience things like fear or concern or worry, and it also helps us react and survive in very difficult situations. So it's fundamentally a negative emotional part of the brain. Another part that's really important, this is kind of a big part, is something called the insula. And the insula also governs different kinds of negative emotions. And is going to become kind of important in ADHD. So if we look at the brains of people who with ADHD, what we find is that the guide is you can actually read my handwriting. Tend to be smaller in volume than the average brain. And so that may sound kind of weird because you may think, well, if it's smaller, doesn't that mean you experience less emotion? We preemptively answered your question. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is why the guide is great. So, top of the dome asked, bigger amygdala equals higher in neuroticism? Actually, it's the opposite. Smaller volume amygdalas. You see that? Psychic.
Whereas oftentimes in the brain, the opposite is true. So a lot of what the brain's tissue does is inhibit stuff. And so for some reason, when we see smaller volumes in the brain of things like the amygdala and the insula.
Look at that. We predicted the question and actually answered it. Like, now this is hype. Was it maybe it's a plant? I don't know. I'm wondering if it was a plant.
It correlates with more emotional responsiveness in ADHD. So something that we'll see in people with ADHD is that sometimes their emotions get the better of them. They kind of become a little bit impulsive. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is part of our fundamental dopamine reward circuitry. And we're going to cover that more elsewhere in the guide as well. But our nucleus accumbens is like what motivates behavior and sort of allows us to feel reward. And we see a couple of important connections here. The first is that in the brains of people with ADHD, the amygdala and the insula have stronger effects on the nucleus accumbens than the average brain. And so what that sort of means is that the behaviors that we engage in are more sensitive to emotions. And that may sound kind of weird, but I'll give you kind of a simple example. So oftentimes people with ADHD will behave very impulsively. And so if we think about what makes a behavior impulsive, like you don't really think about it ahead of time, you sort of suddenly engage in it. And that sudden engagement can oftentimes be due to an emotion. So in sort of a neurotypical individual, what we'll find is that there may be an emotion, but it doesn't immediately translate into behavior. Whereas in ADHD, an emotion is more likely to suddenly create a behavior. So the nucleus accumbens is where we get a sense of reward. And also in ADHD specifically, this is where some of the impulsivity comes from. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is involved with execution and planning of behavior. So for example, this is more generally our frontal lobes, but if I am trying to clean up my room, let's say, or pack for a trip, packing for a trip is an abstract task that has to be broken down into individual pieces. So I have to go grab my toothbrush, grab my toothpaste. Oh, by the way, this tube of toothpaste is too big and security won't let it through, so I need to go get a travel toothpaste. I need underwear, I need these kinds of clothing, I need to take a nice pair of clothing and some casual clothing. Oh, by the way, the hotel I'm staying at has a pool, so I'm also going to take a swimsuit. So if we think about planning tasks and executing on them, that's what our frontal lobes do. So our prefrontal cortex is important for that. We'll get to that in a second. We'll get into more detail in a second. The next part that we're going to talk about is the orbitofrontal cortex. And the orbital frontal cortex is responsible for regulating emotions and decision making. Okay? So we kind of mentioned here that the amygdala and insula
I went extra slow on this video because it's so complicated.
And therefore, emotions will lead to impulsivity. Whereas remember that when we feel like doing something, our brain can actually put the brakes on those feelings, right? So let's say that I feel like yelling at my boss. And I feel that very strongly. The emotion is there, the desire is there, but in my brain, it's kind of like putting the brakes on that. So we don't actually want to yell at my boss. And there's a part of my brain that says, don't do that. That part of the brain in general is going to be the PFC, but the orbitofrontal part of the brain, or the orbitofrontal cortex specifically. The next part that we're going to talk about is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC. So the dorsolateral PFC is the part of our brain that specifically weighs options. Okay, so it looks at things like pros and cons, risks and benefits, alternatives. This is also where contrafactual thinking comes from, if y'all are familiar with that term.
Do y'all remember that lecture? Did y'all catch
And so
that?
essentially our frontal cortex is going to govern a lot of the regulation of other parts of our brain. And this is where it's really important to understand how...
Yeah, so Guide has many advantages. One is that unlike Stream, you get to adjust my speed. And if you're like, oh, okay, like, let's just speed up Dr. K a little bit. Or if I'm going too fast, you can slow me down.
How some of the treatments of ADHD work. So if we think about people with ADHD, their minds tend to move very fast. They get distracted really, really easily. And their thoughts are bouncing all over the place. And what we've found in psychiatry is that we can give people stimulant medication to improve their ADHD. And that may be kind of confusing, but because our experience, if you have a neurotypical brain, is that if you take something that is a CNS or central nervous system or brain depressant, it's going to slow down your thinking. So alcohol will make you think kind of slower, whereas caffeine will kind of speed up your thinking, right?
No, we're saying
so it gets kind of confusing because if ADHD is very rapid thinking, how can a stimulant medication actually slow down their thoughts? Well, it turns out that what stimulant medications do is actually stimulate the frontal cortex. So what we're actually boosting the signal of is our ability to control the rest of our brain. So stimulant medication essentially strengthens our brakes. And I think about the prefrontal cortex as the brakes of our brain. There's one other part of the brain that's important to talk about, which is kind of here, for lack of a better location, which is the anterior cingulate cortex.
Okay, we can watch something else.
Or ACC. And the anterior cingulate cortex is very important because it's essentially the road or the connection between the PFC and our emotions and nucleus accumbens. So what we find in the brains of people with ADHD is their anterior cingulate cortex is kind of weaker, or in a sense, the connections between the prefrontal cortex and their emotional circuitry is weaker. So what we find is that in a neurotypical brain or a normal brain, our frontal cortex is more able to restrain our impulses, more able to restrain our emotions. But in people with ADHD, that connection appears to be weaker. So these are the main components of the brain that we're going to be focusing on in ADHD. And the key thing to remember here is that if we look at the symptoms of ADHD, or what people with ADHD struggle with.
You want to do parenting? Okay, this one's 25 minutes. You guys want to get started on it? Oh no, y'all wanted to do getting overwhelmed, right? We can do this.
So one of the things that I hear more and more about is people getting overwhelmed. And so despite something being really important to you, despite you caring about something a lot, for some reason you kind of get overwhelmed by everything that you have to do. And these things actually matter a lot to you. They feel really important. And we wish that we could approach this in the same way that heroes or heroines in movies do. What the protagonist faces is danger on all sides. They're betrayed over here, they're injured over here, this person didn't come through for them. And even though the pressure mounts higher and higher and higher, instead of buckling under the pressure, they dig deep, work extra hard, and manage succeeding all the way through. But that's not how things work in real life. We sort of get more and more burdened by all of these things going wrong, and instead of doing anything to fix any of the 1,000 problems, we just get buried by all of them, overwhelmed, and feel paralyzed. So what is happening in our mind when we get overwhelmed? Where is it coming from? What causes it? Let's start with neuroscience. So remember that the frontal lobes plan and execute tasks. They take an abstract task, sequence it out, and help us sort of figure out what to do first, what to do second, and what to do third. A great example of this is cleaning your room. So let's assume that my room is clean. And then after about a day or so, there's a little bit of a trash. And so there's like a little bit of motivation in order to clean it. And then the second day that goes by, there's more trash. And suddenly it becomes more important for me to clean it. And I look around and I'm like, oh wow, like this place really needs to be clean. And day 3 comes around and there's like a little bit more junk everywhere. Papers are piled up, there's a little bit of mail in the corner, and the need to clean it rises. And along with the need to clean it, we'll sort of get a higher amount of motivation. So as day 3 rolls around, if I'm lucky, I'm like, okay, I really got to take care of this today. And so I start cleaning it and hopefully I'm good. But if I'm not careful and we go into day 4 and day 5, as the need to clean rises and rises and rises, sometimes we cross this tipping point, this critical point where now we get overwhelmed. Now there's too much to clean, and now we don't know where to start. So there's a very, very subtle relationship between motivation and tasks kind of piling up. As the tasks pile up, or as we get closer to the deadline, we'll see sort of a natural increase in our motivation. But if we're not careful, we'll cross this critical point where we start to feel overwhelmed because now the task is too large. But we've sort of learned a little bit about this already. When a task is too large, what part of the brain governs that? It's the frontal lobes. Because remember, our frontal lobes are the parts of our brain that plan and execute tasks.
So I got to just jump in here for a second. So this is kind of how the guide works. I know the neuroscience lecture is like kind of like, what's the point of this? But that's exactly how the guide is built, because now that we've watched the neuroscience lecture, understanding getting overwhelmed is going to be way easier. So the guide builds on itself. So if you guys need explanations for something that I'm referencing earlier, just like let me know and I'll answer.
So we've also looked at the example of, let's say, a 10-year-old who's told to clean their room and a 4-year-old who's told to clean their room, and how each of their frontal lobes is a little bit different. The 10-year-old's frontal lobes are more developed, so they can plan that task and they can execute it. So essentially what happens is the mess piles up, is the burden of our frontal lobes increases more and more and more. And this is where operationalizing comes in, and we've explored this elsewhere in the module. But there's more to it than neuroscience. There's actually a psychological principle here at play when it comes to being...
So this is another point to understand. So like when we talk about getting overwhelmed, in one part of the video, in one part of the module, we explain the neuroscience. In another part of the video, the module, we explain operationalizing and how to take a task that feels overwhelming, break it apart into its component pieces, and then execute on them. So that's kind of like where, if we think about getting overwhelmed, there's a neuroscience component, there's like almost a skills component, and there's a psychological component. And so to do justice to all of those, like that's why we have this guide.
Being overwhelmed. So let's start with sort of a very simple thought experiment. Do you ever get overwhelmed by something that you're completely apathetic about? Do you really get overwhelmed about, let's say, I don't know, the arrangement of ice cubes in your glass of water? Of course not. It doesn't matter to you, and so we never feel overwhelmed by it. So the opposite of that also is true, which is that we tend to get more overwhelmed the more that we care about something. And this is what's so confusing when it comes to motivation, because we tend to think that the more I care about something, the more motivated I should be. But it turns out that when we sort of enter into the realm of overwhelmed, it's actually the opposite, that the more I care about something, the more paralyzed I actually feel. A good sort of example of this is people who are perfectionistic. And people who are perfectionistic care so much about it. Everything has to be exactly right. And it's precisely because everything has to be exactly right that they are so paralyzed in terms of moving forward. The more we care about something, the more properly it needs to be done. The more properly it needs to be done, the less likely we are to actually compromise, and the more likely we want it to be perfect. And if we're not able to compromise on it, we can't really get started, right? Because most of the time, if you want to accomplish a task, it's not going to be perfect right out of the gate. If I want to write a best-selling novel, I have to start by writing a first draft. The problem is that first draft is a compromise. I'm giving up a little bit of what I want to write. I'm giving up on the dream of writing a best-selling novel by writing a first draft. And that's exactly what's so hard about being overwhelmed. It's paradoxically because we care so much about it that it's so hard to get started. Another way to think about this is that the feeling of overwhelmed and task paralysis actually correlates with perfectionism or how much you care. Because the more you care, the harder it is to compromise. The harder it is to compromise, the harder it is to get started.
Okay, so let me ask y'all a question. Okay, so first of all, I got to say something about the guide. First thing that I want to say is that this guide was made for you. And when I mean made for you, all the examples that I come up with, all the things that I talk about. So people ask, is perfectionism in the guide? Yes and no. It's because I've talked to y'all, right? Like y'all have told me, hey, like we'll have a call-in stream where someone's like, I want to write a book. I don't know if I should get started. I can't get started. I'm paralyzed. I am not motivated. I read so much of the stuff on our subreddit. I look at questions on Discord. You know, like y'all are the ones, like everything that we built is because of the questions that y'all ask. The guide is basically all of the questions that I can't ask because they're a little bit too complicated. The next thing is, since we're streaming this, we're going to try to change things up a little bit. I'm going to ask you, let's see if y'all have been paying attention. So if we're assuming that once we start to realize, okay, like I'm overwhelmed about something, the reason I'm overwhelmed about something is because I actually care about it too much. What's the antidote? Oh, so where's my virginity? Said I stopped caring, so now I have apathy. Great. Okay, anyone else have answers? Just don't care. Less attachment, stop caring. Okay, let's see. Surrender.
So what do we do about this?
Let's see.
And this is where it's a little bit tricky, because remember, we have this assumption that the more important something is, the more I'm motivated towards it. But actually, in the case of being overwhelmed, it's the amount that we care that actually causes us to be paralyzed. So this is where we don't quite want to be apathetic, but we have to be a little bit tricky with how we deal with our mind. So acknowledge first and foremost that this is really, really important to you. And at the same time, acknowledge that you probably need to get started in some way. And this is kind of tricky, but you have to sort of appease the perfectionistic part of you and kind of get started anyway. This is best illustrated with an example. So let's say that I need to email a professor for an extension in a class. And this kind of task may seem very, very simple, but I'm so paralyzed by the prospect of my professor saying no.
We got to pause for a second. So when I say got him, this isn't a competition between you and me, right? We understand this? The reason that I asked y'all for the answer is because what we've tried to do in the guide is like, y'all have already given me the response to the first answer. So we have to account for that. Do y'all get, no, I needed this. No, okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to rewind. We'll just keep going. Do y'all get that? It's not actually like y'all are trying to win and no, like when I anticipate your response, like y'all have allowed me to anticipate your responses because you share your response. And then I try to address that in the guide. Let's go back. Okay.
I'm motivated towards it. But actually in the case of being overwhelmed, it's the amount that we care that actually causes us to be paralyzed. So this is where we don't quite want to be apathetic, but we have to be a little bit tricky with how we deal with our mind. So acknowledge first and foremost that this is really, really important to you. And at the same time, acknowledge that you probably need to get started in some way. And this is kind of tricky, but you have to sort of appease the perfectionistic part of you and kind of get started anyway. This is best illustrated with an example. So let's say that I need to email a professor for an extension in a class. And this kind of task may seem very, very simple, but I'm so paralyzed by the prospect of my professor saying no that I sort of can't bring myself to write the email. So this is a kind of situation where I can't sit down and write the email, whereas what I can sort of do is find a middle ground. What if I were to tell my mind, okay, I know it's really important that we get this extension. The first thing that I'm going to have to do is write the email, but I don't actually have to send it. If I'm happy with the email and if it's perfect, then I can go ahead and send it. But let me just write the email and I'll save it as a draft. So that kind of middle ground is sort of interesting because it sort of forces you into a compromise, or it allows you a compromise, without sort of signing you up for completing the task. So even the part of you that wants that email to be perfect can kind of be appeased by sort of this rationalization that I'm going to draft the email without sending it. And there are even higher stakes situations that I've sort of used this technique with people. So sometimes we sort of fall in love with someone and we really want to confess our feelings. And in that kind of situation, we're sort of terrified because the way that we share our feelings needs to be absolutely perfect. And this is another example, well, where if I have a patient who's in a situation like this, I'll encourage them to like write a letter to this person, but you don't have to send it. The key here is that we need to understand that that part of us that wants to be perfectionistic, that part of us that cares so much, can actually be appeased. We can sort of go halfway there. We can write a draft, we can start the process without going all the way there. That allows us to get started in terms of acting. It allows us to sort of overcome that motivational block and take that first step forward. By sort of not committing to go the whole distance, though, that's how we sort of appease the part of us that is perfectionistic and the part of us that is paralyzed. So what we need to do, rather than pumping the gas and increasing our motivation, is one of two things. The first is we need to make the task easier for ourselves. In the case of our frontal lobes, if the task builds up to be too big, our frontal lobes can't sort of plan and execute that task out. So we need to chunk it up a little bit better through tools like operationalization. The other thing that we need to do is develop some degree of detachment. Because remember that the more overwhelmed we are by something, chances are it's because we care about it a lot. The more that we care about something, the more perfect it needs to be. The more perfect it needs to be, the less likely we are to compromise. The less likely we are to compromise, the harder it is to get started, because your first draft of something is never going to be perfect. So oddly enough, we can use tools like detachment, which is found elsewhere in the module, techniques like vairagya and certain meditation tools. But the other thing that we can do is kind of appease the perfectionistic part of ourselves. Find some sort of middle road that doesn't commit us to a first draft. We're not saying that we're going to submit the first draft to the publisher. So we can sort of use some of these kinds of techniques of drafting something or giving something, kind of the initial attempt without sort of sending it out. And the cool thing about that is that most people actually say that the hardest part of a task is getting started. And when we feel overwhelmed and we feel that task paralysis, we don't know where to start. So the key thing is not going the whole distance, but actually getting started. And the way that you get started is by making that compromise, making that appeasement.
Alrighty. Yeah. So, I guess there's a worksheet that comes with it sometimes, and then you can go, there's like a next suggested video and whatnot. It also, I think, tracks which ones you've watched and which ones you haven't. So one piece of feedback that we got is, this is too overwhelming for me. That's why we take away the labels and you just start at the beginning. Try to make it easy for you. Really, I don't know if y'all kind of noticed, but we address a lot of things in the guide that people need help with, right? So it's like really simple stuff. It's like we can talk about a lot of like deep psychological principles in neuroscience, but at the end of the day, like, how do you send an email to your professor asking for an extension? How do you tell someone how you feel? Like, how do you do stuff? This is why it's Dr. K's Guide to ADHD and doing stuff. How do I do stuff when I'm overwhelmed? And that's where it's not a answer. And that's the biggest problem with like these content platforms. Because like if I watch a TikTok about how to do stuff, it'll have tips, which will be generally applicable, but like the tip may not work for me. So what we've tried to do in the module is like try to get y'all a comprehensive approach. So there's an operationalization component, there's a neuroscience component, there may be an emotional component, there's a component of procrastination, there's a component of perfectionism. And which one applies to you? I don't know. That's why we have the guide. So we have all of the answers, but the ones that work for you are the ones that are going to work for you. So we've tried our best to lay it out. And that's, I know it's a larger module, but that's because like doing stuff is more complicated. Okay. Yeah, right? So like right by nature is spot on. So stop thinking and start doing, even if it's just minimal. The problem is that it's hard to do that. And so what we try to do is help y'all understand what is the resistance to getting started. And once you understand the resistance, then you can overcome it. We get controlled by all kinds of things internally, like because we don't know what's happening, right? Like you just wake up and you're like, I got to do this thing, but I just can't do it. So you have to know, like in that moment, okay, close your eyes and like, what are you looking for? Oh, like, is this the kind of thing where it needs to be perfect to me? And if it needs to be perfect to me, that's why I can't get started, because I know that whatever I'm going to put out there is not going to be sufficient. Okay. Even if I'm unhappy with it, I'm going to appease that part of myself. We're not going to send anything to the professor tonight. We're just going to draft an email. You can delete it tomorrow if you want to. And then we don't get to this in the guide, but what do you think happens tomorrow? You take a look at it, you send a couple edits. Can you send it then? Is writing an email, editing it, and sending it doable? No. Is writing a draft that you're never going to send doable? Yes. Is editing an email, feeling a little bit frustrated by yourself and just hitting one button and sending it off? Is that doable? Absolutely. And that's the point, because what was impossible yesterday is suddenly done by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Piscurio is saying, juke yourself into doing it? Absolutely. That's what the guide is about. It's about juking, manipulating, and understanding your way to action. Whatever it takes. You can't debate yourself unless you understand what kind of debate you need. Right? Okay, who are we rating? We're streaming late today, so we've got options to rate all kinds of people. Grubby? We can rate Grubby. What's Grubby doing? Grubby's playing Dota. Squeaks. Okay, J1GG. Let's do J1GG. I don't know what retro is. I'm down to watch True Sight on stream. That sounds great. Okay, we're gonna raid J1GG. Looks like there's some retro fighting game, so let's check it out. We'll see y'all on Wednesday, okay? Take care, everybody. Feel free to check out the guide. We hope it helps. We worked really hard at it. And it's there for you. We made it for you. So good luck, everybody. We'll see y'all on Wednesday. Boop, boop, boop.